Imagine this. A man wearing an old gray bathrobe and worn bedroom slippers walks slowly down Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village. This was Vincent Chin Gigante, one of the most powerful and clever crime bosses in American history. He pulled off one of the greatest tricks the Mafia had ever seen. For almost 30 years, he tricked the FBI, lawyers, doctors, the media, and even his own neighbors into thinking he was mentally sick. While doing this, he was running a criminal business worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This is the amazing story of the man they called the Oddfather. A tale so unbelievable, it sounds made up. But every word is true. Vincent Louis Gigante was born on March 29, 1928, in a small apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The neighborhood was full of immigrants, but it was also a place where crime grew easily. His father, Salvatore Gigante, was a watchmaker who could fix tiny, delicate watches. But Salvatore also did something else. He was a small-time enforcer for local Italian-American criminal groups that would later become known as La Cosa Nostra. The Gigante family lived in a fourth-floor apartment on Sullivan Street, the same street where Vincent would later act crazy for many years. There were 5 children in the family, and they never had much money. Salvatore's job as a watchmaker barely paid for food, but his other work collecting debts, delivering messages, and sometimes hurting people provided extra money that kept the family going. Vincent's mother, Yolanda, was a very religious woman who spent her days praying for her family and her nights worrying about her husband's dangerous work. She could see the darkness that followed Italian men in their neighborhood. She watched how young boys started by running errands and ended up dead in the street or in prison. She prayed that her children, especially her sons, would find a different path. But the streets of the Lower East Side in the 1930s and 1940s offered few other choices for Italian-American boys. Regular jobs, education, and normal success seemed closed to them. The only men they saw with real power, real money, and real respect were those who took what they wanted through force and cleverness. Young, Vincent was different from his siblings from an early age. While his brothers and sister were happy to follow rules and stay out of trouble, Vincent seemed to always test limits. He was intelligent, maybe too intelligent for his own good, with a quick wit and an even quicker temper. But more than that, he had something that couldn't be taught: presence. Even as a child, when Vincent Gigante walked into a room, people noticed Dot as Vincent grew older. His mother hoped that boxing might give him a legal way to use his aggression, and maybe even a path to success. Boxing was one of the few sports where Italian-American boys could make names for themselves. Yolanda had heard stories of fighters who earned enough money to lift their entire families out of poverty. Vincent took to boxing like he was born for it. He was naturally athletic, with quick reflexes and powerful punches. But more importantly, he was fearless. While other fighters might hesitate before stepping into the ring with a dangerous opponent, Vincent seemed to love the challenge. He earned the nickname Chin during these years. Some say because of his strong jaw. Others claim it was because he could take a punch to the chin better than anyone. By the time he was 17, Vincent was fighting professionally in small venues around New York City. He wasn't a technical boxer. His style was about overwhelming opponents with raw power rather than outmaneuvering them with skill. But it worked. He won most of his fights, often by knockout, and began to attract attention from promoters who saw potential in the young fighter from the Lower East Side. For a brief moment, it seemed like Yolanda's prayers might be answered. Vincent was earning legal money, staying out of trouble, and even talking about bigger fights, maybe even a shot at a title someday. But boxing, like many things in Vincent's life, was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. The same men who controlled the neighborhood's illegal activities also had their fingers in professional boxing. Fights were fixed, bets were placed, and boxers were often used as enforcers or messengers when they weren't in the ring. Vincent found himself being pulled deeper into this world, not just as a fighter, but as a participant in the broader criminal system that surrounded the sport. The end of Vincent's boxing career came suddenly. During a fight in 1947, his opponent went down and didn't get up. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but rumors spread that Vincent's punch had been more devastating than anyone realized. Whether the death was accidental or intentional was never determined. But it marked the end of Vincent's legal career and the beginning of his full-time entry into organized crime. Vincent's change from failed boxer to criminal was smooth, largely because he'd already been living in both worlds at the same time. The men who'd been using him as muscle during his boxing career simply gave him more work and better pay. His first arrest came in 1952 for assault, though the charges were later dropped, when the victim mysteriously decided not to testify. But Vincent wasn't happy just being another street thug. He was intelligent and observant, and he could see that real power in organized crime didn't come from being the strongest or the most violent. It came from being the smartest. He began studying the men above him, learning how they worked, how they made decisions, and how they kept control over their territories and their men. The early 1950s were a time of big change in organized crime. The old guard, men who'd built their power during Prohibition, were aging or being put in prison. A new generation was rising, men who understood that the future of organized crime lay not in flashy violence, but in smart business operations that made steady, enormous profits while staying under the radar. Vincent attached himself to one of the rising stars in this new generation, Vito Genovese. Genovese was everything that Vincent wanted to become: intelligent, ruthless, and absolutely in control. He didn't need to raise his voice or throw punches to command respect. His reputation and his strategic mind were enough. Under Genovese's teaching, Vincent began to learn the real lessons of power. The first lesson was patience. While other young criminals were eager to make names for themselves through bold, violent acts, Vincent learned to wait, to watch, and to strike only when the moment was perfect. The second lesson was the importance of loyalty, not the blind loyalty of a soldier, but the calculated loyalty of someone who understood that his own success was tied to the success of his superiors. But perhaps the most important lesson Vincent learned during these years was the power of lies. He watched as Genovese manipulated rivals, allies, and law enforcement through carefully crafted lies and misdirection. Truth, Vincent realized, was less important than what people believed to be true. And if you could control what people believed, you could control almost everything. Vincent's reputation as someone who could handle delicate situations quietly led to his involvement in one of the most important events of his early criminal career: the attempted murder of Frank Costello in 1957. Costello was the head of what would later become known as the Genovese family. But at the time, he and Vito Genovese were fighting for control of the organization. Genovese had decided that Costello needed to be killed, but the hit had to be handled carefully. Costello was well connected and well protected, and a failed murder attempt could lead to a war that would be terrible for everyone involved. The job required someone who was skilled, reliable, and completely loyal to Genovese. Vincent Gigante was chosen. On the evening of May 2nd, 1957, Frank Costello returned to his apartment building at the Majestic on Central Park West. As he walked through the lobby, Vincent came out from the shadows and fired a single shot at Costello's head. But the bullet only grazed Costello's scalp, and the older man survived. The failed murder was both a disaster and an opportunity for Vincent. On one hand, he'd failed to complete the most important assignment of his career. On the other hand, he'd shown his willingness to take on the most dangerous jobs for his boss, and he'd shown that he could keep his mouth shut even under intense police questioning. Vincent was arrested and charged with attempted murder, but the case against him was weak. Koslow himself refused to identify Vincent as his attacker, claiming he hadn't seen who shot him. Other witnesses were either too frightened to testify or had suddenly developed convenient memory problems. After spending several months in jail, Vincent was released when the charges were dropped. Though the Koslow case didn't result in a conviction, Vincent's next arrest did. In 1959, he was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for drug conspiracy. For many criminals, prison is simply a temporary pause in their careers. But for Vincent, it became a graduate school in criminal strategy. Federal prison in the late 1950s and early 1960s was full of smart criminals, men who'd built empires through careful planning and strategic thinking rather than simple violence. Vincent spent his time learning from these men, absorbing their lessons about organization, discipline, and the long-term thinking required to build lasting criminal businesses. But perhaps more importantly, prison gave Vincent time to think about his own future. He could see that the traditional model of organized crime, the flashy lifestyle, the public presence, the obvious displays of power was becoming increasingly dangerous. Law enforcement was getting better, using new technologies and legal strategies that made it harder for criminals to operate in the open. Vincent began to create a strategy that would define the rest of his career. If the government was getting better at identifying and putting obvious criminals in prison, then the solution was to become an unobvious criminal. He needed to find a way to exercise power while appearing powerless, to control huge criminal operations while seeming unable to control. Anything at all without the idea that would eventually turn into his. Decades-long performance of mental illness began to take shape during these prison years. Vincent had always been a keen observer of human nature, and he'd noticed how people treated those they saw as weak or damaged. They underestimated them, ignored them, and most importantly, they didn't see them as threats. What if, Vincent wondered, he could convince everyone law enforcement, rivals, even his own people, that he was mentally unable to function, not just strange or unpredictable, but genuinely unable to work in the world? It would be a never-before-tried strategy requiring discipline and commitment that no criminal had ever attempted. But if it worked, it would make him almost untouchable. When Vincent was released from prison in 1964, he returned to a criminal world that had changed a lot. Vito Genovese was still in prison, and the family was being run by a series of acting bosses. There were opportunities for advancement, but Vincent knew he needed to be patient and strategic about how he pursued them. He began by rebuilding his reputation as a reliable soldier. He handled collections, solved disputes, and carried out the occasional act of violence when necessary. But he was careful to keep a low profile, avoiding the kind of flashy displays that attracted law enforcement attention. During this period, Vincent also began trying out the act that would eventually define his career. He started showing occasional signs of being strange, talking to himself in public, wearing odd clothing, making weird comments that didn't quite make sense. To most people, these seemed like minor personality quirks. But Vincent was carefully testing each behavior, seeing how far he could push the limits of normal behavior before people began to take notice. The key, he realized, was being subtle. If he suddenly started acting completely insane, people would be suspicious. But if his odd behavior developed slowly over time, people would think it was a natural mental decline rather than a planned performance. He began laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most elaborate tricks in criminal history. Vincent also used this period to build a network of loyal helpers who would be important to his future success. He identified men who were intelligent, quiet, and completely devoted to him personally, rather than just to the organization. These men would eventually become the inner circle that allowed Vincent to run a criminal empire while keeping up his act of being unable to function One of the most remarkable things about Vincent's eventual success was his understanding of how people's minds work when it comes to deception. He realized that people see what they expect to see, and once they form an opinion of someone, they tend to interpret all future evidence in ways that confirm the opinion. Vincent also understood that the most effective lies contain pieces of truth. If he was going to convince people that he was mentally ill, he needed to base his act on real mental health conditions that people could recognize and understand. He began studying mental illness, learning about the symptoms and behaviors connected with various conditions. But perhaps most importantly, Vincent understood that successful lying requires absolute commitment. If he was going to convince people that he was unable to function, he had to be willing to pay the personal costs that such a trick would require. He would have to give up the traditional rewards of criminal success, the public respect, the obvious displays of power, the recognition of his accomplishments. He would have to be happy exercising power from the shadows while letting others receive credit for his successes. The personal cost of such a trick would be huge. He would have to keep up the act, not just in public, but around his family, his friends, and even his own criminal partners. The line between Vincent Gigante, the man, and Vincent Gigante, the act, would become harder and harder to see. And there would be times when even he wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. When Vito Genovese was released from prison in 1964, he found his criminal organization in need of rebuilding. The world of organized crime had changed during his time away, with federal law enforcement becoming smarter and rival families making moves into Genovese territory. He needed reliable men who could adapt to these new challenges while keeping the discipline and loyalty that had always characterized his organization. Vincent Gigante had proven himself during Genovese's absence. While other members of the family had grown careless or lazy, Vincent had kept a low profile while steadily building his reputation and his network of contacts. When Genovese began looking for men to handle his most sensitive operations, Vincent's name consistently came up. Genovese began using Vincent for increasingly important jobs. These weren't just the simple debt collections or territory disputes that made up most soldiers' work. Vincent was given the task of negotiating truces between warring groups, settling disputes between powerful captains, and handling situations that required both intelligence and absolute secrecy. During this period, Vincent also began to show the strategic thinking that would eventually make him one of the most successful crime bosses in American history. While other criminals focused on immediate profits, Vincent thought in terms of long-term sustainability. He understood that the most successful criminal businesses were those that made steady income over many years rather than big profits that attracted unwanted attention. Vincent's approach to criminal business was remarkably smart. He studied legal businesses to understand how they worked and adapted those rules to illegal activities. He emphasized efficiency, customer service, and risk management in ways that were new in organized crime. His gambling and loan sharking operations became models for other criminals to copy. But perhaps most importantly, Vincent began to develop the network of legal contacts that would be important to his later success. He built relationships with lawyers, judges, police officers, and politicians, not through bribes or threats, but through the kind of personal connections that made these people willing to do small favors without thinking of them as corruption. Vincent was developing his strategic and business skills. He never lost his reputation as someone who could handle violence when necessary. But his approach to violence, like his approach to everything else, was calculated and strategic rather than impulsive or emotional. Vincent understood that in organized crime, violence is a tool of last resort, but it must be a perfectly effective tool when it's needed. The threat of violence is often more powerful than violence itself, but that threat is only believable if everyone knows you're willing and able to follow through. Vincent's reputation in this regard was unquestioned by the late 1960s. Vincent had become one of Vito Genovese's most trusted lieutenants, with responsibility for several of the family's most profitable operations. His primary focus was on gambling and loan sharking, but he also oversaw construction schemes, labor union infiltration, and various forms of fraud and theft. Vincent's gambling operations were particularly smart. Rather than running simple numbers games or card rooms, he developed a network of bookmaking operations that took bets on everything from horse races to professional sports. These operations were staffed by knowledgeable employees who could calculate odds and manage risk in ways that made sure they were consistently profitable. His loan sharking business was equally professional. Vincent understood that the most successful loan shark operations were those that kept good relationships with their customers. He offered reasonable interest rates to reliable borrowers and worked out payment plans for those who had temporary money troubles. Violence was used only against those who tried to cheat the system or who threatened the operation's security. Vincent also began to invest in legal businesses that could serve as fronts for illegal activities or that could make legal income to add to his criminal profits. He invested in restaurants, construction companies, and trucking firms, always making sure that these businesses were run professionally and profitably in their own right. The key to Vincent's success during this period was his understanding that criminal organizations, like legal businesses, succeed through careful planning, efficient operations, and good customer service. While other criminals were focused on short-term gains, Vincent was building sustainable businesses that could make income for decades. Vincent's rise wasn't without problems. In 1969, he was arrested again, this time for conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the death of a suspected informant. The case was eventually dismissed due to lack of evidence, but it served as a wake-up call for Vincent about law enforcement becoming smarter. Federal authorities were using new investigation techniques: wiretaps, surveillance photography, financial analysis that made traditional criminal operations increasingly risky. Vincent realized that criminals who continued to work in the old ways would eventually be caught and successfully put in prison. This realization sped up Vincent's thinking about the act he would eventually adopt. If law enforcement was getting better at identifying and prosecuting obvious criminals, then the solution was to become an unobvious criminal. He began to study how other successful criminals had avoided being put in prison, looking for strategies that he could adapt to his own situation. When Vito Genovese died in prison in 1969, Vincent lost not just his mentor, but his primary protector within the family. Genovese's death created a power vacuum that several ambitious criminals were eager to fill, and Vincent found himself in a potentially risky position. However, Vincent's reputation for intelligence, reliability, and secrecy served him well during this transition period. Rather than making a grab for power himself, he positioned himself as a valuable ally to whoever emerged as the new leader of the family. This strategy allowed him to keep his position and his operations while avoiding the internal conflicts that often come with leadership changes in criminal organizations. New boss of the Genovese family was Frank Fonzie Thierry, a veteran criminal who valued loyalty and ability above flashiness or ambition. Vincent's low-key approach and proven track record made him a natural ally for Thierry, who began to rely on Vincent for many of the same sensitive jobs that Genovese had trusted to him. Under Thierry's leadership, Vincent's responsibilities within the family continued to grow. He was given control over larger territories and more profitable operations, and he was increasingly involved in the family's strategic planning and decision-making. By the early 1970s, he was widely recognized as one of the most powerful figures in the Genovese organization. But Vincent was already thinking beyond his current position. He could see that Thierry was getting older, and that the family would eventually need new leadership. Vincent began positioning himself, not just as a valuable lieutenant, but as a potential successor to the top position in the family. Vincent's approach to preparing for eventual leadership was characteristically careful and long-term. Rather than trying to force his way to the top through violence or political maneuvering, he focused on making himself essential to the family's operations while building the loyalty and respect of other members. Change of Vincent Gigante from respected mob soldier to seemingly mentally unable neighborhood oddball didn't happen overnight. It began in the early 1970s with small, almost impossible to notice changes in his behavior that most people initially dismissed as stress, aging, or simply the quirks of a man who'd lived a hard life. Those closest to Vincent began to notice that he would sometimes pause in the middle of conversations, staring off into space as if he'd forgotten what he was saying. He would mumble to himself while walking down the street, sometimes gesturing at invisible companions. His clothing choices became increasingly unusual, wearing multiple sweaters in summer heat or showing up to meetings in bedroom slippers and a bathrobe. But these early signs of Vincent's condition were carefully planned. He'd spent years studying mental illness, talking with doctors supposedly for real health concerns, and watching patients at psychiatric facilities. He understood that genuine mental illness rarely shows up as dramatic, obvious symptoms. Instead, it usually involves subtle, behavioral changes that slowly become more noticeable over time. Vincent's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than suddenly appearing to be insane, which would have raised immediate suspicions, he allowed people to witness what appeared to be a slow mental decline. Those who knew him began to explain his behavior, the stress of criminal life, the effects of aging, perhaps some underlying condition that was slowly showing itself. His mother, Yolanda, was among the first to notice the changes, and her genuine concern for her son's well-being became an important part in selling the trick to others. When associates asked about Vincent's behavior, they could see the worry in his mother's eyes and hear the pain in her voice as she described her son's apparent decline. This added a layer of authenticity to the act that would have been impossible to fake. Vincent's decision to fake mental illness wasn't impulsive. It was the result of careful analysis of the changing world of organized crime and law enforcement. By the early 1970s, federal prosecutors were having unprecedented success in prosecuting organized crime figures, largely due to the RICO Act Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which had been passed in 1970. RICO allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than individual crimes, making it possible to convict crime bosses even when they weren't directly involved in specific criminal acts. The law was specifically designed to reach the leadership of organized crime families, and it was proving devastatingly effective. Vincent understood that traditional methods of avoiding being put in prison, scaring witnesses, bribing officials, or simply staying away from criminal activities, were becoming not enough against these new legal weapons. He needed a strategy that would make him literally unable to be prosecuted, and mental incompetence offered exactly that protection. Under federal law, a defendant who is mentally incompetent cannot stand trial. If prosecutors cannot prove that a defendant understands the charges against him and can help in his own defense, the case must be stopped indefinitely. Vincent had found a legal loophole that could potentially give him permanent protection from being put in prison. But the strategy required far more than just acting crazy in court. To be believable, Vincent's mental incompetence would have to be clear in all parts of his life. He would need to convince not just prosecutors and judges, but also FBI agents, psychiatrists, journalists, and his own neighbors that the act was consistent, sustainable, and absolutely convincing. Vincent's apparent mental decline created a crisis within the Genovese family. On one hand, he was one of their most valuable and trusted members, with control over several profitable operations and extensive knowledge of the family's activities. On the other hand, a mentally incompetent member represented a potential security risk that could threaten the entire organization. Family boss Frank Thierry was faced with a difficult decision. If Vincent was genuinely mentally ill, he would need to be removed from positions of responsibility and possibly killed if he posed a threat to family security. But if he was faking his condition, then his strategy was so bold and potentially effective that it deserved the family's full support. Thierry's solution was characteristically practical. He allowed Vincent to keep his criminal activities while slowly shifting the appearance of control to other family members. Vincent's top lieutenants were given more visible roles in day-to-day operations, while Vincent himself began to fade into the background, appearing increasingly as a figurehead rather than an active leader. This arrangement worked for everyone involved. Vincent could continue to exercise real control over his operations while appearing to be uninvolved in criminal activities. His lieutenants gained status and recognition within the family while remaining completely loyal to Vincent, and the family as a whole benefited from Vincent's strategic thinking while being protected from the Yazidi security risks that his apparent condition might pose. The arrangement also required the cooperation and secrecy of dozens of family members and associates, all of whom had to keep up the fiction of Vincent's incompetence while continuing to take orders from him. This level of organizational discipline was unprecedented in organized crime, and it spoke to both Vincent's leadership abilities and the loyalty he'd built within his organization. Vincent's most visible performances took place in his Greenwich Village neighborhood, where he'd lived most of his life and where he was known to longtime residents as a quiet, helpful man who took care of his elderly mother. The change of this respected community member into an apparent mental patient had to be handled with particular care. Vincent began by slowly increasing how often and how visibly he showed his strange behaviors. He would take long walks through the neighborhood in various states of undress, sometimes in a bathrobe and slippers, sometimes in mismatched clothing, sometimes having animated conversations with people who weren't there. He would stop at parking meters and speak to them as if they were old friends, or stand in the middle of sidewalks gesturing at invisible companions. The key to making these acts believable was Vincent's deep understanding of his neighbors and what they expected. He knew that people in the neighborhood had always seen him as somewhat strange, so slow increases in weird behavior would seem like natural progression rather than sudden change. He also knew that his neighbor's genuine affection for his family, particularly his mother, would make them more sympathetic to his apparent condition than suspicious of it. Vincent's daily walks became a neighborhood tradition. Residents would see him shuffling down Sullivan Street at the same time each day, and his presence became so familiar that people began to plan their schedules around his appearances. Children would point and stare, but adults would look away respectfully, treating him with the kind of sympathetic distance that people typically give to those who are clearly mentally ill. These public acts served multiple purposes. They established Vincent's reputation for incompetence among ordinary citizens who might later be called as witnesses in federal trials. They gave FBI surveillance teams countless hours of footage showing Vincent behaving in ways that seemed inconsistent with criminal leadership, and they created a public image that was so far removed from the typical image of a Kuali crime boss that it became difficult for prosecutors to convince juries that this harmless-seeming old man could be running a sophisticated criminal empire. One of the most challenging parts of Vincent's trick was convincing medical professionals that his condition was genuine. Unlike ordinary citizens or even law enforcement officers, doctors and psychiatrists had the training and experience to recognize the difference between real mental illness and calculated performance. Vincent's approach to this challenge was characteristically careful. He began by establishing relationships with several different doctors, claiming various physical problems that required ongoing medical attention. These relationships gave him opportunities to display his symptoms in clinical settings while building a medical history that could support claims of mental incompetence. He also studied the specific symptoms and presentation of various mental illnesses, particularly those that might affect an older man with his background and history. He learned about dementia, depression, anxiety disorders, and other conditions that could explain his behavior while making it difficult for doctors to give a clear diagnosis. Vincent's performances for medical professionals were more subtle than his public displays. He would show confusion about dates and times, have difficulty following complex conversations, and show signs of memory problems that could indicate mental decline. But he was careful to avoid symptoms that could be easily tested or checked, instead focusing on subjective experiences that depended largely on his own self-reporting. The medical records that Vincent built up during this period would later prove important to his legal defense. When federal prosecutors tried to argue that his mental incompetence was faked, Vincent's attorneys could point to years of consistent medical documentation that supported their clients' claims of illness. While Vincent's strategy was strategically brilliant, it came at enormous personal cost. Keeping up such an elaborate trick required him to give up many of the traditional rewards and pleasures of criminal success. He couldn't enjoy public recognition for his accomplishments, couldn't display his wealth openly, and couldn't even acknowledge his real relationships with his own criminal associates. The act also took a toll on Vincent's family relationships. His wife and children had to watch him pretend to be mentally ill, never knowing when he was acting and when he might be expressing genuine thoughts or feelings. They had to answer questions from neighbors, deal with the stigma of having a family member who appeared to be mentally ill, and keep up their own versions of the family's public act. Vincent's mother, Yolanda, was perhaps the most affected by the trick. She genuinely worried about her son's mental health, even as she played an important role in keeping up the illusion of his incompetence. Her real concern and confusion about Vincent's condition became one of the most convincing parts of his act. But it also represented a deep betrayal of their relationship. The isolation required by the trick was also mentally challenging. Vincent had always been a social man who enjoyed the respect and friendship of his criminal associates. The need to appear mentally incompetent meant that he had to give up much of this social interaction, instead limiting himself to a small circle of completely trusted allies who knew the true nature of his condition. Perhaps most difficult was the need to keep up the act. Even during private moments, Vincent could never be completely certain that he wasn't being watched or recorded, so he had to stay in character, even when he was alone or with family. The line between Vincent Gigante the man and Vincent Gigante the act became harder and harder to see, and there were times when even his closest allies wondered how much of his behavior was planned and how much might be genuine. Despite his apparent mental incompetence, Vincent's criminal operations continued to do well during the 1970s. His gambling and loan sharking businesses made millions of dollars in yearly income. His construction and labor union schemes provided steady income and political influence, and his network of legal businesses served as effective fronts for money laundering and other illegal activities. Key to keeping these operations going while appearing incompetent was Vincent's exceptional organizational skills and his ability to delegate authority while keeping ultimate control. He developed a system of communication that allowed him to give orders and receive reports without appearing to be involved in criminal decision-making. Vincent's top lieutenants became masters of interpreting his seemingly incoherent rambling, understanding that certain phrases, gestures, or behavioral cues contained specific instructions about criminal activities. To outsiders, these interactions looked like the confused conversations of a mentally ill man being humored by his caretakers. In reality, they were sophisticated business. Meetings where complex criminal operations were planned and coordinated. This system of coded communication became so sophisticated that Vincent could have detailed discussions about territory disputes, personnel decisions, and strategic planning while appearing to be having random, meaningless conversations about the weather, his mother's cooking, or imaginary friends. FBI surveillance teams recorded thousands of hours of these conversations without recognizing their true meaning. Vincent also used his apparent mental illness as cover for activities that would have seemed suspicious if done by an obviously competent criminal. He could meet with lawyers, accountants, and other professionals while appearing to be a confused client who was being helped with his affairs by well-meaning relatives or friends. He could visit locations connected to his criminal businesses while seeming to be an old man who was simply wandering around the neighborhood in a confused state. Frank Funzi. Thierry's leadership of the Genovese family during the 1970s was marked by steady profits, minimal internal conflict, and successful avoidance of major law enforcement actions. Much of this success was due to his reliance on Vincent Gigante's strategic thinking and operational expertise. Even as Vincent appeared to be increasingly disconnected from criminal activities. By the mid-1970s, Vincent had effectively become the power behind Thierry's throne. While Thierry kept the public role of family boss, Vincent was making most of the important decisions about operations, personnel, and strategy. This arrangement allowed the family to benefit from Vincent's exceptional leadership abilities, while keeping up the fiction that he was mentally incompetent. Arrangement also served Vincent's long-term interests. By letting Thierry remain as the visible head of the family, Vincent avoided the attention that typically focused on crime bosses, while positioning himself to eventually take official control of the organization. When law enforcement agencies made their lists of organized crime leaders, Vincent's name appeared far down the list, if it appeared at all. Thierry's declining health in the late 1970s created an opportunity for Vincent to slowly take on more direct control over family operations. Rather than staging a dramatic takeover that would have attracted attention, Vincent simply began handling more on the day-to-day responsibilities that Thierry could no longer manage effectively. When Thierry died of natural causes in 1981, Vincent was the obvious successor, but his apparent mental condition created a unique situation. How could a man who seemed unable to manage his own personal affairs be trusted with running a multi-million-dollar criminal business? Vincent's solution to this problem was to become the first invisible boss in organized crime history. Rather than taking the traditional public role of a crime family leader, he remained in the background while allowing others to serve as his public representatives and apparent successors to Thierry. The family structure that Vincent created was unprecedented in its sophistication. He established multiple layers of leadership, with different individuals handling various parts of the organization's operations. To outsiders, these men appeared to be the real leaders of the family, making decisions and giving orders based on their own authority. In reality, they were putting into action policies and strategies that Vincent had developed, using communication methods that made his involvement invisible to law enforcement. This structure gave Vincent multiple benefits. It gave him believable deniability for criminal activities, since he appeared to have no official role in the family's leadership. It allowed him to continue his act of mental incompetence while exercising complete control over criminal operations. And it created confusion among law enforcement agencies about who was actually running the Genovese family, making it difficult for them to focus their investigative efforts effectively. Vincent's management style during this period was remarkably similar to that of a legal corporate CEO. He focused on long-term strategic planning rather than day-to-day operations, gave authority to trusted subordinates while keeping ultimate control over important decisions, and emphasized efficiency and profitability over territorial expansion or violent confrontations with rivals. Vincent's base of operations was his modest apartment on Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village, the same neighborhood where he'd grown up and where he'd been staging his public acts of mental illness for years. To casual observers, this seemed like an unlikely location for the headquarters of a major criminal organization, which was exactly what Vincent intended. The apartment itself was unremarkable. A small, cluttered space filled with old furniture, religious items, and the accumulated possessions of an elderly man who lived with his mother. But beneath this ordinary exterior, the apartment served as the nerve center for criminal activities that made hundreds of millions of dollars in yearly income. Vincent's daily routine at the apartment was carefully planned to keep up his public image while allowing him to conduct criminal business. He would spend hours sitting by the window, apparently staring off into space or talking to himself, while actually watching the neighborhood for signs of law enforcement surveillance. He would receive visits from men who appeared to be caring for a mentally ill relative, but who were actually his top lieutenants reporting on various criminal operations. The apartment's location in Greenwich Village provided several strategic advantages. The neighborhood's bohemian culture and tradition of tolerance for strange behavior made Vincent's public image seem less unusual than it might have in other areas. The narrow, winding streets made surveillance difficult for law enforcement agencies, and the closeness to legal businesses and professional offices allowed Vincent's associates to meet with lawyers, accountants, and other professionals without attracting attention. Under Vincent's leadership, the Genovese family's criminal operations expanded both in size and sophistication. While keeping traditional activities like gambling and loan sharking, Vincent also moved the family into new areas that reflected his understanding of changing economic conditions and opportunities. The family's gambling operations during the 1980s were among the most sophisticated in organized crime. Rather than relying only on traditional numbers games and sports betting, Vincent expanded into casino-style gambling operations that offered better odds and more attractive environments for customers. These operations were staffed by knowledgeable employees who could calculate odds and manage risk in ways that made sure they were consistently profitable while giving customers fair games. Vincent's loan sharking operations were equally professional. He understood that the most successful loan shark operations were those that kept good relationships with their customers while charging rates that were competitive with other sources of credit. His organization offered various types of loans with different terms and conditions and worked with borrowers to change payments when necessary to avoid defaults. Family also expanded a lot into labor racketeering. During this period, Vincent understood that control over labor unions provided both direct income through various schemes and indirect benefits through the ability to influence construction projects, trucking operations, and other legal businesses. His organization gained influence over several major unions in the New York area, allowing them to take money from employers while also helping workers through improved wages and working conditions. Construction industry involvement became particularly profitable for the family during the 1980s. Building boom in New York City. Vincent's organization could influence who got major contracts, control the supply of materials and labor, and make sure that projects went smoothly without work disruptions or other problems. These services were valuable enough that many legal construction companies were willing to pay a lot of money for the family's protection and help. One of Vincent's most significant innovations was his approach to money laundering and financial management. While other crime families often struggled to convert their illegal money into usable assets, Vincent developed sophisticated systems for cleaning money and investing it in legal businesses and financial instruments. Vincent understood that successful money laundering required more than just finding ways to hide criminal money. It also required creating legal businesses that could make documented income to justify the lifestyle and spending of family members. He invested heavily in restaurants, construction companies, trucking firms, and other businesses that could serve both as money laundering vehicles and as sources of legal income. The family's financial operations during this period included several banks, finance companies, and other institutions that could provide loans and other services to both criminal associates and legal customers. These businesses were run professionally and profitably, making income that could be reported to tax authorities while also providing services that supported the family's criminal activities. Vincent also understood the importance of international financial systems and began developing relationships with banks and financial institutions in other countries. These relationships allowed the family to move money across national borders, invest in foreign businesses and real estate, and create complex financial structures that made it difficult for law enforcement agencies to trace criminal money. Perhaps most importantly, Vincent emphasized the importance of paying taxes on legal income and keeping detailed financial records that could satisfy government scrutiny. While this approach reduced the family's short-term profits, it provided long-term protection against the kind of tax evasion charges that had brought down many other criminal leaders. As Vincent's power and responsibilities within the Genovese family increased during the 1980s, he paradoxically intensified his public act of mental incompetence. The more control he exercised over criminal operations, the more important it became to convince observers that he was unable to do such leadership. Vincent's public appearances during this period became increasingly bizarre and unpredictable. He would wander through Greenwich Village at all hours, sometimes having animated conversations with imaginary companions, sometimes standing motionless for long periods as if he'd forgotten where he was going. He would show up at family gatherings dressed inappropriately, make nonsensical comments during conversations, and generally behave in ways that reinforced the impression that he was mentally ill. These acts were so convincing that even some family members began to wonder if Vincent's condition might be partially genuine. The line between calculated act and actual behavior became so blurred that it was sometimes difficult to figure out where one ended and the other began. Vincent's interactions with law enforcement during this period were particularly masterful. When FBI agents approached him for questioning, he would respond with confused rambling that seemed to show he had no understanding of what they were asking. When he was ordered to appear before grand juries, his attorneys would present medical evidence of his incompetence that made it impossible for prosecutors to force his testimony. The total effect of these acts was to create a public image that was completely inconsistent with criminal leadership. By the mid-1980s, Vincent Gigante was widely known in New York City as a harmless neighborhood oddball who wandered around Greenwich Village in his bathrobe, talking to parking meters and living with his elderly mother. The idea that this man could be running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history seemed ridiculous to most observers. By the mid-1980s, Vincent's daily routine had become a carefully planned act that served multiple purposes: keeping up his public act of mental incompetence, doing criminal business, and gathering intelligence about law enforcement activities in his neighborhood. Each morning, Vincent would come out of his Sullivan Street apartment dressed in a bathrobe, pajamas, and bedroom slippers, regardless of the weather or season. His appearance was deliberately messy, Uncombed hair, unshaven face, clothing that was often mismatched or wrong for the conditions. To neighbors and casual observers, he looked like a man who was unable to care for himself properly. His walks through Greenwich Village followed no clear pattern or purpose. He would shuffle slowly down Sullivan Street, sometimes stopping to stare at buildings or to have conversations with people who weren't there. He would pause at parking meters and speak to them as if they were old friends, gesturing strongly and occasionally appearing to listen to their responses. He would stand in the middle of sidewalks for long periods, apparently lost in thought or confusion. But these seemingly random wanderings served specific purposes. Vincent was watching his neighborhood, looking for signs of law enforcement activity, noting changes in local businesses or residents, and identifying potential security risks. His routes took him past locations that were important to his criminal operations, allowing him to watch these sites without appearing to have any interest in them. The timing of Vincent's walks was also strategic. By appearing on the streets at consistent times each day, he established patterns that would be recorded by FBI surveillance teams, creating a documented record of behavior that supported his claims of mental incompetence. The FBI spent thousands of hours and enormous resources documenting Vincent's daily routines, never realizing that these observations were actually providing evidence that supported his legal defense. Strategy. One of the most famous parts of Vincent's act was his habit of stopping to have lengthy conversations with parking meters throughout Greenwich Village. To observers, these interactions seemed to be clear evidence of his mental illness. Who but a crazy person would talk to objects as if they were friends? But Vincent's parking meter conversations served several sophisticated purposes. They allowed him to watch without appearing to be looking at anything specific, since he could observe entire street blocks while appearing to be focused on his conversation with the meter. They provided cover for meetings with associates who could approach him while he was talking to a meter and have brief conversations that appeared to be attempts to help a confused old man. The conversations also allowed Vincent to communicate with his organization through a complex system of coded messages. Associates who witnessed these interactions learned to interpret certain phrases, gestures, and behaviors as instructions about criminal activities. What appeared to be the random rambling of a mentally ill person was actually a sophisticated method of giving orders and receiving reports about ongoing operations. Vincent's parking meter conversations became so famous that they were featured in newspaper articles and television reports about organized crime in New York City. Law enforcement officials often cited them as evidence of Vincent's mental incompetence, never suspecting that they were witnessing one of the most elaborate criminal communication systems ever created. The media attention that these conversations created actually served Vincent's purposes by reinforcing his public image as a harmless oddball. The more widely known his crazy behavior became, the more difficult it would be for prosecutors to convince juries that he was actually a sophisticated criminal leader. Vincent's act of mental illness extended far beyond his public appearances on the streets of Greenwich Village. He also kept up an elaborate medical theater that involved regular visits to hospitals and psychiatric facilities where he would display symptoms of various mental conditions for trained medical professionals. These medical acts required different skills than his street-level acting. Doctors and psychiatrists had professional training that made them more difficult to fool than ordinary citizens or even law enforcement officers. Vincent had to display symptoms that were consistent with genuine mental illness while avoiding behaviors that might be easily tested or checked. Vincent's hospital visits typically involved complaints about depression, anxiety, and memory problems that could be consistent with various forms of mental illness or mental decline. He would appear confused about dates and times, have difficulty following complex conversations, and show signs of the kind of disorientation that might affect an elderly man with psychological problems. The medical records that Vincent built up during these visits became important evidence in his later legal battles. When federal prosecutors argued that his mental incompetence was faked, Vincent's attorneys could point to years of consistent medical documentation from multiple healthcare providers that supported their clients' claims of illness. Vincent also built relationships with several psychiatrists and psychologists who examined him regularly and provided professional opinions about his mental state. These relationships were kept over many years, allowing Vincent to build a consistent medical history that would be difficult for prosecutors to dismiss as a recent fake. The sophistication of Vincent's medical trick was remarkable. He understood the specific symptoms and presentations associated with various mental illnesses, and he was able to display these symptoms convincingly enough to fool trained professionals who examined him repeatedly over many years. Keeping up such an elaborate trick required enormous personal sacrifices, not just from Vincent, but from his entire family. His wife, children, and other relatives had to participate in various parts of the act while dealing with the emotional cost of watching their husband, father, and brother pretend to be mentally ill. Vincent's mother, Yolanda, played a particularly important role in the trick. Her genuine concern for her son's apparent condition became one of the most convincing parts of his act. When associates, neighbors, or law enforcement officials asked about Vincent's behavior, they could see the real worry in his mother's eyes and hear the pain in her voice as she described her son's decline. But this real emotional response came at enormous personal cost to Yolanda. She lived with constant uncertainty about her son's real condition, never knowing when his behavior reflected genuine thoughts and feelings and when it was a calculated act. She had to deal with neighbors' questions and concerns about Vincent's mental health while keeping the family's privacy and protecting Vincent's criminal activities. Vincent's wife and children faced similar challenges. They had to explain Vincent's behavior to friends, colleagues, and teachers while keeping up the fiction that he was genuinely mentally ill. They had to cope with the stigma associated with having a family member who appeared to be mentally unstable, and they had to keep up their own versions of the family's public act about the isolation required by the trick. Was particularly difficult for family members. They couldn't discuss Vincent's real activities or accomplishments with friends or extended family members, and they had to be constantly careful about what they said and did in public to avoid undermining this elaborate fiction that protected the family's security and income. Perhaps most challenging was the need to keep emotional relationships with Vincent, while never being completely certain which parts of his personality were genuine and which were act. Family members learned to communicate with Vincent through subtle cues and private moments when they could be relatively certain he was not acting for outside observers. Vincent's act of mental incompetence was particularly important in his ongoing game with FBI surveillance teams. By the 1980s, the Bureau was dedicating enormous resources to documenting the activities of suspected organized crime leaders using sophisticated surveillance techniques that included photography, video recording, and electronic eavesdropping. Vincent's apparent mental illness created unique challenges for these surveillance operations. FBI agents found themselves spending thousands of hours documenting the behavior of a man who appeared to be mentally incompetent, producing reports that described his conversations with parking meters, his inappropriate clothing choices, and his apparent confusion about basic parts of daily life. These surveillance reports, which were intended to document Vincent's criminal activities, actually became evidence that supported his legal defense. When prosecutors later tried to argue that Vincent was mentally competent to stand trial, his attorneys could point to years of FBI surveillance documentation that showed consistent patterns of behavior indicating mental illness. Vincent was also able to use his apparent condition to watch law enforcement. His daily walks through Greenwich Village allowed him to identify FBI surveillance teams and to watch their activities, while his conversations with imaginary companions provided cover for watching and analyzing law enforcement tactics. The FBI's frustration with Vincent's act was clear in their reports and internal communications during this period. Agents understood that they were probably being tricked, but they couldn't prove it, and their own documentation seemed to support Vincent's claims of mental incompetence rather than contradicting them. Vincent's act of mental incompetence was not just about avoiding day-to-day law enforcement attention. It was part of a comprehensive legal strategy designed to make him literally unable to be prosecuted under federal law. This strategy was based on the legal rule that defendants who are mentally incompetent cannot stand trial, even if there is overwhelming evidence of their criminal activities. Under federal law, defendants must be able to understand the charges against them and help in their own defense in order to be tried for criminal offenses. If psychiatric evaluations determine that a defendant lacks these abilities, the trial must be stopped indefinitely until the defendant's competence is restored. Vincent's legal team understood that this rule could give him permanent protection from being put in prison if his mental incompetence could be convincingly documented and kept up. They worked closely with Vincent to make sure that his behavior was consistent with genuine mental illness and that medical documentation supported claims of incompetence. The legal strategy also involved careful management of Vincent's interactions with law enforcement and court officials. When he was ordered to appear before grand juries or in court proceedings, Vincent would display behavior that seemed to show he was confused about the proceedings and unable to participate meaningfully in his own defense. These court appearances became theatrical acts in their own right, with Vincent appearing disheveled and confused, making inappropriate comments, and generally behaving in ways that reinforced impressions of mental illness. His attorneys would present medical evidence and expert testimony supporting claims that Vincent was incompetent to stand trial. Despite his elaborate act of mental incompetence, Vincent's criminal operations continued to do well throughout the 1980s. His gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering activities made enormous profits, while his network of legal businesses provided effective cover for money laundering and other illegal activities. The key to keeping these operations going while appearing incompetent was Vincent's sophisticated system of indirect communication and giving tasks to others. He had trained his top lieutenants to interpret his seemingly incoherent instructions and to carry out complex criminal strategies, while keeping up the fiction that Vincent was not involved in decision-making. Vincent's criminal organization during this period operated with remarkable efficiency and discipline. Despite the challenges created by his public image, the family's operations were among the most profitable and well-managed in organized crime. This success was proof of Vincent's strategic thinking and organizational abilities, even as he convinced the world that he was unable to manage his own personal affairs. The contrast between Vincent's apparent incompetence and his organization's obvious success created mental confusion for law enforcement officials who investigated the Genovese family. They could see that the organization was well led and strategically managed, but they struggled to match this reality with Vincent's public behavior and medical documentation. By the late 1980s, Vincent's act of mental incompetence had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication and commitment. He had been keeping up the trick for nearly 2 decades, and it had become so much a part of his identity that the line between act and reality was often unclear even to those closest to him. Vincent's public appearances during this period were increasingly bizarre and unpredictable. He would sometimes appear in public wearing multiple layers of clothing in summer heat, or go outside in winter, whether dressed only in pajamas and a bathrobe. He would have animated conversations with invisible companions, sometimes appearing to argue with them or to be receiving important information from them. These acts were so convincing that they created sympathy and concern from neighborhood residents who had known Vincent for decades. Many people who had grown up with him genuinely believed that he was suffering from mental illness and needed care and protection. This real community concern became another layer of protection for Vincent's trick, the medical documentation supporting Vincent's mental incompetence had also reached impressive levels of detail and consistency. Multiple healthcare providers had examined him regularly over many years, and their records showed patterns of behavior and symptoms that were consistent with various forms of mental illness and mental decline. Vincent's legal team had put together what may have been the most comprehensive medical defense in the history of organized crime prosecution. They had documentation from psychiatrists, psychologists, neurologists, and other medical specialists, all of whom had examined Vincent and concluded that he suffered from mental conditions that would make him incompetent to stand trial by the late 1980s. The FBI's organized crime task forces had identified Vincent Gigante as a person of significant interest. Despite his public image as a mentally incompetent neighborhood oddball, federal agents understood that there was often a disconnect between appearance and reality in organized crime, and Vincent's combination of apparent helplessness and obvious influence within the Genovese family raised suspicions that couldn't be ignored. The Bureau launched one of the most extensive surveillance operations in its history, dedicating enormous resources to documenting Vincent's daily activities, associations, and behavior patterns. Teams of agents followed him through Greenwich Village, photographed his interactions with associates, and recorded his conversations whenever possible. The surveillance was so intensive that Vincent rarely appeared in public without federal agents, somewhere nearby documenting his every move. These surveillance operations created thousands of hours of audio and video recordings, along with detailed written reports describing Vincent's behavior. FBI agents documented his conversations with parking meters, his inappropriate clothing choices, his apparent confusion about basic parts of daily life, and his interactions with family members and associates who seemed to be caring for a mentally ill relative. But the surveillance teams faced unique challenges in investigating Vincent. Unlike other organized crime figures who might display obvious signs of wealth, power, and criminal activity, Vincent appeared to live the life of a poor, mentally ill man who depended on others for basic care. His daily routine consisted mainly of wandering around his neighborhood in a bathrobe, having conversations with objects, and sitting in his apartment staring out the window. The agents assigned Vincent's surveillance detail often found themselves questioning the value of their work. They were highly trained law enforcement professionals who had been assigned to document the activities of a man who appeared to spend his days talking to parking meters and shuffling around Greenwich Village in his pajamas. Many of them began to wonder if the Bureau's suspicions about Vincent were wrong. Electronic surveillance of Vincent presented even greater challenges than physical observation. Federal agents got court orders to wiretap Vincent's telephone and to place listening devices in his apartment, expecting to record conversations that would reveal his involvement in criminal activities. Instead, the wiretaps recorded hours of apparently meaningless conversations between Vincent and his associates, family members, and imaginary companions. Vincent would ramble incoherently about his health, his mother's cooking, neighborhood gossip, and various other topics that seemed to have no connection to organized crime. When associates visited his apartment, the conversations captured on tape sounded like the interactions between caretakers and a confused elderly man. FBI analysts spent countless hours reviewing these recordings, searching for hidden meanings, coded references, or subtle signs that Vincent was more competent than he appeared. They brought in experts on organized crime communication, linguists who specialized in interpreting coded speech, and psychiatrists who could analyze Vincent's behavior for signs that his mental illness might be faked, but the analysis consistently failed to reveal evidence that contradicted Vincent's public image. The recorded conversations seemed to support the impression that Vincent was genuinely mentally ill and uninvolved in criminal decision-making. When associates discussed family business in his presence, Vincent would either stay silent or make comments that seemed unrelated to the conversation. The wiretaps also recorded Vincent's private conversations with family members, which seemed to provide real glimpses into the life of a mentally ill man struggling with psychological problems. These recordings showed Vincent expressing confusion about his condition, frustration with his limitations, and genuine emotional distress about his situation. To FBI analysts, these private moments seemed to confirm that Vincent's mental illness was real rather than acted. The FBI, agents assigned to investigate Vincent, found themselves in an unprecedented situation. They were convinced that Vincent was involved in organized crime, but their investigation was producing evidence that seemed to support his claims of mental incompetence rather than contradicting them. Some agents began to question whether the Bureau's suspicions about Vincent were correct. If he was genuinely mentally ill, then the surveillance operation was not only wasteful but potentially cruel, subjecting a sick man to constant watching and harassment. These agents argued that the Bureau should focus its limited resources on criminals who were actually capable of criminal leadership. But other agents remained convinced that Vincent was staging an elaborate trick. They pointed to inconsistencies in his behavior, moments when he seemed more alert and focused than his condition would suggest, and the obvious respect that other criminals showed him despite his apparent incompetence. These agents argued that Vincent's act was simply more sophisticated than any previous criminal trick. The internal debate within the FBI about Vincent's true condition reflected broader questions about the nature of mental illness and the challenges of telling the difference between genuine psychological problems and calculated acting. Federal agents found themselves talking with medical experts, studying psychiatric literature, and developing new investigative techniques designed to detect faked mental illness. The frustration felt by many FBI agents was made worse by the knowledge that Vincent's organization was obviously successful and well managed, suggesting competent leadership somewhere within the family structure. If Vincent wasn't providing this leadership, then someone else was, and the Bureau's focus on Vincent might be preventing them from identifying the real decision-makers. The development of RICO racketeer, influenced and corrupt organizations act prosecution strategies in the 1980s was supposed to give federal prosecutors powerful new tools for taking apart organized crime families. RICO allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than individual crimes, making it possible to convict crime bosses even when they weren't directly involved in specific criminal acts. But RICO prosecutions required prosecutors to show that defendants were members of criminal businesses and that they participated in the affairs of these businesses through patterns of racketeering activity. Vincent's apparent mental incompetence created unique challenges for prosecutors who wanted to use RICO against the Genovese family. How could prosecutors argue that a man who appeared to be mentally ill was capable of participating in sophisticated criminal businesses? How could they convince juries that someone who talked to parking meters and wandered around Greenwich Village in his pajamas was actually making strategic decisions about multi-million-dollar criminal operations? Vincent's legal team understood these challenges and structured his defense specifically to take advantage of the weaknesses in RICO prosecutions of mentally incompetent defendants. They argued that even if Vincent had been involved in criminal activities in the past, his current mental condition made it impossible for him to continue such involvement. The medical documentation supporting Vincent's mental incompetence became a powerful weapon against RICO charges. His attorneys could present years of psychiatric evaluations, medical records, and expert testimony, showing that Vincent suffered from mental conditions that would prevent him from understanding complex criminal businesses or making rational decisions about illegal activities. Federal prosecutors' attempts to bring Vincent to trial were repeatedly frustrated by court-ordered psychiatric evaluations that found him incompetent to stand trial. Under federal law, defendants who cannot understand the charges against them or help in their own defense cannot be put on trial, regardless of the strength of the evidence against them. Vincent went through multiple competency evaluations by court-appointed psychiatrists and psychologists, all of whom concluded that he suffered from mental conditions that made him incompetent to stand trial. These evaluations were done by respected medical professionals who had no obvious bias in favor of Vincent's defense, making their conclusions difficult for prosecutors to challenge. The competency evaluation process became another opportunity for Vincent to show his acting abilities. During these sessions, he would display confusion about the legal proceedings, inability to understand complex questions, and general disorientation that convinced medical experts that he was genuinely mentally ill. Vincent's act during competency evaluations was particularly sophisticated because he understood that these examinations would be more thorough than casual observations of his behavior. He had studied the specific rules that medical professionals use to determine competency, and he was able to display exactly the right combination of symptoms to support findings of incompetence, while avoiding behaviors that might seem obviously faked. Consistency of these competency findings over many years created a powerful legal precedent that protected Vincent from being put on trial. Even prosecutors who were convinced that Vincent was faking his mental illness found it difficult to overcome the weight of professional medical opinion that supported his incompetency. Claims Vincent's act of mental incompetence was so convincing that it attracted significant media attention, with newspapers and television programs featuring stories about the crazy mob boss who wandered around Greenwich Village in his bathrobe, talking to parking meters. This media coverage generally reinforced Vincent's public image and made his defense strategy more effective. Journalists who covered Vincent's story typically portrayed him as a harmless, pathetic figure who had obviously lost his grip on reality. The contrast between his current appearance and his alleged criminal past was so dramatic that many reporters seemed to assume that his mental illness was genuine, focusing their stories on the tragic decline of a once powerful criminal rather than questioning whether his condition might be faked. The media coverage also gave Vincent valuable information about law enforcement activities and public perceptions of his case. By monitoring news reports about his situation, Vincent and his attorneys could measure the effectiveness of his act and adjust their strategy accordingly. Some reporters did raise questions about whether Vincent might be faking his mental illness, but these skeptical accounts were usually overwhelmed by more sympathetic coverage that portrayed him as a sick old man who deserved treatment rather than prosecution. The weight of media opinion generally supported Vincent's defense strategy rather than hurting it. The FBI's frustration with Vincent's act led to increasingly sophisticated attempts to break through his trick and gather evidence of his actual criminal activities. Federal agents developed new surveillance techniques, brought in specialized medical consultants, and worked with prosecutors to develop legal strategies that might overcome Vincent's competency. Defenses. Some FBI agents proposed using undercover agents to get closer to Vincent's organization and gather intelligence about his actual role in family activities. But Vincent's security precautions and his associates' loyalty made such operations extremely dangerous and unlikely to succeed. The few attempts to get inside Vincent's organization were quickly detected and stopped without producing useful intelligence. Federal agents also tried to use financial investigations to show Vincent's competence and criminal involvement. They analyzed his bank records, tax returns, and financial transactions, looking for evidence of wealth or business activities that would be inconsistent with his apparent mental incompetence. But Vincent's financial arrangements were as carefully built as his behavioral act. His legal income was modest and well documented, consisting mainly of disability benefits and help from family members. His criminal money was laundered through complex networks of associates and businesses that made it difficult to trace money back to him directly. The Bureau also tried to use technological surveillance to gather evidence that might contradict Vincent's public image. They used sophisticated listening devices, cameras, and other equipment in hopes of recording Vincent when he thought he was unobserved and might drop his mental illness act. These technological surveillance efforts produced some interesting results, but nothing that definitely proved Vincent was faking his condition. There were moments when he seemed more alert and focused than his condition would suggest, but these could be explained as temporary periods of clarity that are common in many forms of mental illness. Federal prosecutors faced an unprecedented challenge in their attempts to bring Vincent to trial. They were convinced that he was the leader of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country, but they couldn't prove that he was mentally competent enough to stand trial for his alleged crimes. The prosecution strategy evolved to focus on Vincent's associates and subordinates, hoping to build cases against other family members that might eventually implicate Vincent or provide evidence that contradicted his claims of mental incompetence. This approach had some success, with several high-ranking Genovese family members being convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, but prosecuting Vincent's associates without being able to prosecute Vincent himself created its own challenges. Defense attorneys for other family members could argue that their clients were being prosecuted for crimes that were actually planned and directed by someone who was legally incompetent to stand trial. This argument raised questions about the fairness of prosecuting subordinates while the ILLEGED leader remained free due to mental illness. Prosecutors also tried to develop legal theories that would allow them to prosecute Vincent, despite his apparent mental incompetence. They argued that his condition might be temporary or treatable, and that he should be held for treatment until he could be restored to competency and tried for his alleged crimes. But these arguments faced significant legal and practical obstacles. Vincent's medical records showed a consistent pattern of mental illness over many years, making it difficult to argue that his condition was temporary. And there were serious ethical questions about forcing medical treatment on someone only to make them competent for criminal prosecution. The prosecution's frustration with Vincent's case led to broader discussions within the federal justice system about how to handle defendants who claim mental incompetence. Vincent's case became a landmark in the development of legal standards and procedures for evaluating and prosecuting allegedly incompetent defendants. The first significant threat to Vincent's elaborate trick came from an unexpected source. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino crime family, who decided to cooperate with federal authorities in 1991. Gravano's decision to break the traditional code of silence, omerta, and testify against his former associates sent shockwaves through organized crime and gave prosecutors unprecedented insights into the inner workings of New York's crime families. Gravano's testimony was particularly damaging to Vincent because it came from someone who had extensive personal experience with organized crime, leadership, and could speak with authority about the difference between genuine mental illness, and calculated acting. During his meetings with federal agents, Gravano described meetings and conversations with Vincent that seemed inconsistent with severe mental incompetence. According to Gravano, Vincent had participated in high-level discussions between crime family leaders about territory disputes, business arrangements, and strategic planning. Gravano described Vincent as articulate, strategic, and clearly in command of detailed information about criminal operations. These accounts directly contradicted the public image of Vincent as a confused, incompetent man who was unable to understand complex situations. Gravano also gave prosecutors insights into the organizational structure of the Genovese family that suggested Vincent was exercising real authority, despite his apparent condition. He described how other crime family leaders treated Vincent with respect and deference that would be inappropriate if he were genuinely mentally ill and uninvolved in criminal activities. Perhaps most importantly, Gravano's cooperation showed that the traditional code of silence that had protected organized crime leaders was breaking down. If someone as highly placed as Gravano was willing to testify against former associates, other family members might also be persuaded to cooperate with authorities and provide testimony that could contradict Vincent's claims of mental incompetence. Vincent's long-running act of mental illness created increasing tensions within the Genovese family as younger members began to question the wisdom of being led by someone who appeared to be mentally incompetent. These internal pressures were made worse by successful prosecutions of other family members and growing law enforcement pressure on the organization's operations. Some family members began to express private doubts about Vincent's condition, wondering whether his apparent mental illness was genuine or whether it was a calculated strategy that was becoming counterproductive. These doubts were particularly strong among younger members who hadn't grown up with Vincent and didn't have the personal loyalty that characterized his longtime associates. The generational divide within the family became increasingly clear during the 1990s. Older members who had worked with Vincent for decades remained fiercely loyal and supportive of his leadership strategy. But younger members who were more concerned with immediate profits and status than long-term strategic thinking began to question whether the family would be better served by more visible and aggressive leadership. These internal tensions were complicated by the practical challenges of running criminal operations under Vincent's leadership style, the elaborate communication systems and security precautions required by his trick made it difficult for family members to do business efficiently, and some associates began to feel frustrated under the restrictions imposed by Vincent's need to keep up his public act. Vincent's response to these internal pressures showed his continued strategic thinking and leadership abilities. He quietly removed or pushed aside family members who seemed unreliable or disloyal, while promoting associates who fully supported his approach and understood the long-term benefits of his trick. Strategy. Federal prosecutors' success in using RICO prosecutions against other organized crime families during the 1990s created a template for potentially prosecuting the Genovese family and Vincent himself. The convictions of John Gotti, the boss of the Gambino family, and other high-profile crime leaders showed that RICO could be effectively used against sophisticated criminal organizations. These successful prosecutions also gave prosecutors valuable intelligence about organized crime operations and communication methods that could be applied to investigating Vincent's activities. Former members of other crime families who had been convicted and were cooperating with authorities provided insights into interfamily relationships and business arrangements that implicated the Genovese family and Vincent. Personally, The RICO prosecutions also established legal precedents about mental competency and criminal responsibility that could potentially be used against Vincent. Courts had ruled in other cases that defendants could be held responsible for criminal acts committed while they were mentally competent, even if they later developed mental illness that made them incompetent for trial. These precedents suggested that prosecutors might be able to build cases against Vincent based on his activities during periods when his mental competence could be established, even if his current condition made him incompetent for trial. This approach would require extensive investigation of Vincent's historical behavior and detailed analysis of his medical records to identify periods of apparent competence. Success of RICO prosecutions also increased pressure on Vincent's associates to cooperate with authorities. Family members who were facing lengthy prison sentences under RICO charges had strong reasons to provide information that might reduce their own punishment, even if such cooperation required them to contradict Vincent's claims of mental incompetence. Advances in surveillance technology during the 1990s gave law enforcement agencies new tools for investigating Vincent's activities and potentially breaking through his trick. Digital recording equipment, sophisticated listening devices, and computer analysis of behavioral patterns offered possibilities for gathering evidence that had not been available during earlier investigations. The FBI began using advanced audio enhancement techniques to analyze recordings of Vincent's conversations, searching for evidence of consistent speech patterns or linguistic sophistication that might contradict his apparent mental illness. Computer analysis of his vocal patterns and language use provided some intriguing results, but nothing that definitely proved his competence. Video surveillance technology also improved significantly during this period, allowing agents to record Vincent's behavior with greater clarity and detail than had been possible in earlier investigations. High-definition video recordings of Vincent's daily activities gave prosecutors evidence that they hoped might be used to challenge his claims of mental incompetence. The FBI also began using behavioral analysis experts to study Vincent's recorded activities, looking for inconsistencies or patterns that might indicate calculated acting rather than genuine mental illness. These analyses identified some moments when Vincent seemed more alert and focused than his condition would suggest. But the experts could not definitely conclude that his behavior was faked. Perhaps most importantly, advances in medical technology and psychiatric evaluation techniques provided new possibilities for assessing Vincent's mental condition more accurately. Brain imaging technologies and sophisticated psychological testing methods offered the potential for more objective assessments of mental competence than had been available in earlier evaluations. As Vincent's case became more widely known during the 1990s, it attracted increasing media attention from journalists who were skeptical of his mental illness claims and investigated his story more thoroughly than earlier reporters had done. This increased scrutiny created new challenges for keeping up his trick and gave prosecutors potential evidence that could be used against him. Investigative reporters began doing detailed analyses of Vincent's behavioral patterns, comparing his public appearances with his alleged criminal activities and looking for inconsistencies that might indicate trickery. Some of these investigations identified moments when Vincent seemed more competent than his condition would suggest, though none provided definite proof that his mental illness was faked. The media coverage also included interviews with former associates and family members who provided insights into Vincent's character and abilities that seemed inconsistent with severe mental illness. While these sources couldn't speak directly about Vincent's current condition due to loyalty concerns, their descriptions of his past intelligence and strategic thinking raised questions about the authenticity of his apparent Decline. Television documentaries and newspaper series about Vincent's case brought national attention to his story and increased public interest in whether his mental illness might be faked. This attention created pressure on law enforcement agencies and prosecutors to resolve questions about Vincent's competence and either prosecute him, definitely establish that he was genuinely mentally ill. The increased media scrutiny also gave Vincent and his legal team valuable information about public perceptions of his case and law enforcement investigative strategies. By monitoring media coverage, they could identify potential weaknesses in their defense strategy and adjust their approach accordingly. Vincent's legal team was forced to adapt their defense strategy in response to increasing prosecution pressure and evolving legal standards for determining mental competence. The simple claim that Vincent was mentally ill and therefore incompetent for trial was becoming more difficult to sustain as prosecutors developed more sophisticated methods for challenging such claims. Defense strategy evolved to focus more heavily on the consistency and duration of Vincent's apparent mental illness, emphasizing that his condition had been documented by multiple medical professionals over many years. This approach made it more difficult for prosecutors to argue that his condition was recently faked or temporary. Vincent's attorneys also began to emphasize the severity of his alleged condition, arguing that he suffered from multiple mental disorders that would make it impossible for him to understand complex criminal charges or participate meaningfully in his own defense. This more comprehensive approach to his incompetency defense required more extensive medical documentation and expert testimony. The legal team also developed backup strategies for responding to potential evidence that might contradict Vincent's claims of mental incompetence. They prepared arguments that apparent moments of clarity or competence could be explained by the variable nature of mental illness, which can involve periods of improvement followed by worsening. Perhaps most importantly, Vincent's legal team began to prepare for the possibility that his trick might eventually be discovered and he might be forced to stand trial. They developed alternative defense strategies based on other legal theories that could be used if his mental incompetence claims were definitely proven false. The increasing pressure on Vincent's organization during the 1990s forced significant changes in how the Genovese family worked. The elaborate communication systems and security precautions that had protected Vincent's trick were becoming more difficult to keep up as law enforcement. Surveillance became more sophisticated and family members faced increasing pressure to cooperate with authorities. Vincent was forced to give more authority to trusted associates while reducing his own direct involvement in criminal operations. This giving away strategy helped protect him from direct legal exposure, but it also made it more difficult for him to keep tight control over family activities and make sure that his strategic vision was being put into action effectively. Family's organizational structure during this period became even more complex and compartmentalized, with multiple layers of insulation between Vincent and actual criminal activities. This structure provided legal protection, but also created communication challenges and increased the risk that important information might not reach Vincent, or that his instructions might be misunderstood or ignored. These organizational changes also created opportunities for ambitious family members to increase their own power and influence within the organization. While Vincent remained the ultimate authority, the practical necessities of his trick strategy meant that other family members were exercising more independent authority than had been typical in earlier periods. Vincent's response to these challenges showed his continued strategic thinking and adaptability. He carefully managed the delegation process to make sure that authority was given only to completely trusted associates. And he developed new methods for keeping oversight and control over family operations despite his reduced direct involvement. The increasing pressure on Vincent's trick during the 1990s took an enormous personal toll on both Vincent and his family members. The stress of keeping up such an elaborate act for more than 2 decades, combined with the growing legal and media scrutiny, created psychological and emotional challenges that became increasingly difficult to manage. Vincent's family members found themselves under growing pressure from law enforcement, officials who were convinced that they were participating in an elaborate fraud. FBI agents regularly approached family members with questions about Vincent's condition and behavior, creating constant stress and anxiety about keeping up the family's protective act. The media attention also created new challenges for family members who found themselves subject to public scrutiny and guessing about their roles in Vincent's alleged trick. This attention made it more difficult for them to keep normal relationships and activities, as they were constantly aware that their behavior might be interpreted as evidence for or against Vincent's mental illness claims. Perhaps most difficult was the psychological impact of living with such an elaborate trick for so many years. Family members had to keep up the fiction of Vincent's mental illness even during private family gatherings and intimate moments, never being completely certain when they could speak freely and when they needed to keep up their acts. Vincent himself was showing signs of the enormous stress involved in keeping up his trick for more than 2 decades. While he remained committed to his strategy and continued to show remarkable discipline in keeping up his act, those closest to him could see the psychological toll that such sustained trickery was taking on his mental and physical health. The line between Vincent's acted mental illness and his actual psychological state was becoming harder and harder to see, with even his closest associates sometimes uncertain about which parts of his behavior reflected calculated acting and which might represent genuine psychological effects of his long-running trick. On June 11, 1997, federal prosecutors took their most aggressive step yet in their decades-long pursuit of Vincent Gigante. A federal grand jury in Manhattan returned a sweeping RICO indictment charging Vincent with conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. The 21-count indictment also named 14 other members and associates of the Genovese crime family, effectively targeting the entire leadership structure of the organization. The indictment represented the end result of one of the longest and most complex organized crime investigations in FBI history. Federal agents had spent nearly 3 decades documenting Vincent's activities, building up thousands of hours of surveillance recordings, hundreds of photographs, and testimony from dozens of cooperating witnesses. The case file was so extensive that it filled several rooms at the FBI's New York field office. What made this indictment different from previous attempts to prosecute Vincent was the prosecution's strategy for dealing with his claims of mental incompetence. Rather than simply accepting his condition as a barrier to prosecution, federal prosecutors announced their intention to challenge his competency claims directly, arguing that his mental illness was an elaborate fraud that had tricked the justice system for decades. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Kelly, told reporters that the government had evidence showing that Vincent was a shrewd, intelligent, and calculating individual who had successfully faked mental illness for over 30 years in order to avoid prosecution. This marked the first time that federal prosecutors had explicitly accused Vincent of faking his condition rather than simply questioning its severity. The indictment included specific allegations about Vincent's role as the boss of the Genovese family, describing him as the ultimate authority for decisions about murders, extortion, gambling, and other criminal activities. Prosecutors claimed that Vincent had used his apparent mental illness as a cover while continuing to run one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States. Charges in the indictment carried potential sentences totaling more than 100 years in federal prison, making it clear that prosecutors were seeking to make sure that Vincent would spend the rest of his life behind bars if convicted. This raised the stakes enormously and made it more important than ever for Vincent to keep up his competency defense successfully. The 1997 indictment was supported by the most comprehensive collection of evidence that prosecutors had ever put together against an organized crime leader. This evidence included surveillance recordings, financial documents, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis that prosecutors claimed definitely proved Vincent's competence and criminal leadership. The surveillance evidence was particularly compelling. FBI recordings captured Vincent having detailed conversations about criminal activities with associates who treated him with obvious respect and deference. In one recorded conversation, Vincent was heard discussing the murder of a potential informant, with language that prosecutors claimed showed clear understanding of complex criminal issues. Financial evidence showed that Vincent had access to large amounts of money despite his claims of poverty and inability to manage his own affairs. Bank records revealed complex financial transactions involving accounts controlled by Vincent's associates, suggesting a level of financial sophistication that seemed inconsistent with severe mental illness. Witness testimony came from several former members of the Genovese family who had decided to cooperate with federal authorities. These witnesses described Vincent as an intelligent, strategic leader who was clearly in command of family operations despite his public image. Some witnesses claimed to have witnessed Vincent dropping his crazy act during private meetings, speaking clearly about criminal business. Perhaps most damaging was testimony from Vincent's own former driver and bodyguard, who claimed that Vincent had explicitly told him about keeping up the mental illness trick. According to this witness, Vincent had said that the key to successful trickery was consistency, and that he could never afford to break character, even for a moment. Prosecutors also presented behavioral analysis evidence put together by FBI experts who had studied thousands of hours of surveillance footage. This analysis identified patterns in Vincent's behavior that the experts claimed were inconsistent with genuine mental illness and more consistent with calculated acting. Vincent's legal team, led by prominent criminal defense attorney Michael Marinaccio, faced the most challenging case of their careers. They had to defend not only against serious criminal charges, but also against the government's claim that Vincent's entire public image for the past 30 years had been an elaborate fraud. The defense strategy focused heavily on the medical evidence supporting Vincent's mental incompetence. Vincent's attorneys put together a team of psychiatric experts who had examined him over many years and were prepared to testify that his mental illness was genuine and severe. These experts argued that Vincent suffered from multiple psychiatric conditions that would make it impossible for him to understand the charges against him or help in his own defense. The defense team also challenged the government's surveillance evidence, arguing that the recordings had been taken out of context and misinterpreted by prosecutors who were determined to prove their theory about Vincent's trick. They claimed that moments when Vincent seemed lucid or competent could be explained by the variable nature of mental illness, which can involve temporary periods of clarity. Vincent's attorneys also emphasized the consistency and duration of his apparent mental illness, pointing out that his condition had been documented by multiple independent medical professionals over nearly 3 decades. They argued that it would be impossible for someone to keep up such an elaborate trick for so long without being detected by trained psychiatrists and psychologists. The defense strategy also included character witnesses who testified about Vincent's genuine concern for his elderly mother and his reputation in Greenwich Village as a harmless neighborhood oddball who needed care and protection. These witnesses helped humanize Vincent and make his claims of mental illness more sympathetic to potential jurors. Perhaps most importantly, the defense team prepared to argue that even if Vincent had been involved in criminal activities in the past, his current mental condition made it impossible for him to continue such involvement or to stand trial for his alleged crimes before Vincent could be tried on the criminal charges. Federal judges had to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. This required extensive competency hearings involving multiple psychiatric evaluations, medical testimony, and legal arguments about the standards for determining mental competence in federal court. The competency hearings became a trial within a trial, with prosecutors presenting evidence that Vincent's mental illness was faked and defense attorneys arguing that his condition was genuine and severe. Both sides brought in expert witnesses, including psychiatrists, psychologists, and behavioral analysts who offered conflicting opinions about Vincent's mental state. Government psychiatric experts testified that their examinations of Vincent revealed evidence of malingering and that his symptoms were inconsistent with genuine mental illness. They pointed to moments when Vincent seemed more alert and focused than his claimed condition would suggest, and they argued that his behavior showed signs of calculated acting rather than real psychological distress. The defense's psychiatric experts offered contrary opinions, testifying that Vincent suffered from genuine mental illness that would make him incompetent to stand trial. They argued that the government's experts had misinterpreted Vincent's symptoms and that his condition was consistent with various forms of mental illness and mental decline that could affect elderly individuals. Competency hearings also included testimony from family members, associates, and neighbors who described their observations of Vincent's behavior over many years. This testimony gave the court a detailed picture of Vincent's daily life and public image, but it also revealed conflicting interpretations of the same behavioral evidence. The competency evaluation process took more than 2 years, with multiple rounds of psychiatric examinations and legal arguments. During this time, Vincent remained free on bail, continuing his daily routines in Greenwich Village, while the federal court system struggled to determine whether he was mentally competent enough to stand trial for his alleged crimes. 1997 indictment and following. Competency hearings attracted unprecedented media attention, with reporters from around the world covering what many called the trial of the century. The case had all the elements that fascinated the public: organized crime, elaborate trickery, mental illness, and the question of whether one man had successfully fooled the federal government for 3 decades. News programs featured extensive coverage of Vincent's daily walks through Greenwich Village, with reporters and camera crews documenting his behavior and interviewing neighbors about their observations of his condition. The contrast between his appearance as a harmless, confused old man and the government's allegations that he was a sophisticated criminal mastermind created compelling television drama. Newspaper and magazine articles explored every part of Vincent's life and alleged crimes, with investigative reporters examining his family background, criminal history, and medical records. Some publications supported the government's theory that Vincent was faking his mental illness, while others suggested that his condition might be genuine. The media coverage also included extensive analysis of the legal and psychiatric issues involved in determining mental competency for trial. Legal experts debated the standards that courts should use for evaluating claims of mental illness, while medical professionals discussed the challenges of telling the difference between genuine psychiatric conditions and calculated trickery. The intense media scrutiny created additional pressure on Vincent and his family, who found themselves subject to constant public attention and guessing. Every public appearance, every interaction with reporters, and every statement by family members or attorneys was analyzed for clues about Vincent's true mental state. The media coverage also influenced public opinion about Vincent's case, with polls showing that Americans were divided about whether his mental illness was genuine or faked. This public interest created additional pressure on prosecutors and judges to resolve the competency question definitely. Vincent's case raised complex legal questions about mental competency, criminal responsibility, and the rights of defendants who claimed to be mentally ill. These questions had implications that extended far beyond Vincent's individual case, potentially affecting how the federal court system handled similar cases in the future. The primary legal question was whether defendants could be held responsible for criminal acts committed while they were allegedly mentally incompetent, and whether the duration and consistency of claimed mental illness should affect determinations of competency for trial. Vincent's case presented an extreme example of these issues, with claims of mental illness extending over 3 decades. Federal courts also had to consider whether the sophistication and success of Vincent's alleged criminal organization was relevant to determinations of his mental competency. Prosecutors argued that the obvious competent leadership of the Genovese family proved that Vincent was mentally capable, while defense attorneys claimed that other family members could have provided such leadership without Vincent's involvement. The case also raised questions about the burden of proof for establishing mental incompetency and the standards that courts should use for evaluating competing psychiatric opinions. Vincent's case involved conflicting testimony from respected medical professionals, making it difficult for judges to determine which opinions were more believable. Perhaps most importantly, Vincent's case highlighted the challenges that the federal justice system faced in prosecuting sophisticated criminals who used claims of mental illness to avoid prosecution. If Vincent was indeed faking his condition, his success in avoiding trial for decades suggested that existing legal standards and procedures might be not enough for dealing with such elaborate tricks. The legal precedents established by Vincent's case would influence how federal courts handled similar cases for years to come, making the competency determination crucial, not just for Vincent, but for the broader development of criminal law and procedure. As the competency hearings progressed, and it became increasingly likely that Vincent might be found competent to stand trial, the Genovese family faced a critical decision about how to protect their leader and their organization. The family's response to this crisis showed both their loyalty to Vincent and their understanding of the broader implications of his potential conviction. Family members who had kept up Vincent's trick for decades continued to support his claims of mental illness, providing testimony and evidence that supported his competency defense. Their loyalty remained absolute, even as the personal costs of keeping up the trick continued to grow. The family also took steps to protect their criminal operations in case Vincent was convicted and imprisoned. They reorganized their activities to reduce their dependence on Vincent's direct leadership, while keeping the organizational discipline and strategic thinking that had characterized his leadership. These preparations revealed the sophisticated nature of Vincent's organization and the extent to which his leadership had influenced every part of the family's operations. Even the possibility of his removal from active leadership required careful planning and coordination among multiple levels of the organization. The family's response also showed their understanding that Vincent's case had implications beyond his personal fate. If he was successfully prosecuted after decades of apparent mental illness, it could encourage other family members to cooperate with authorities and could give prosecutors new strategies for pursuing organized crime cases. Perhaps most importantly, the family's continued loyalty to Vincent during this crisis reflected the genuine respect and affection that he had earned through decades of effective leadership. Even those who might have benefited from his removal remained committed to protecting him and keeping the organization that he had built. On April 7, 2003, after years of legal maneuvering, psychiatric evaluations, and competency hearings, Vincent Gigante made a decision that stunned the legal world and proved right federal prosecutors, who had spent decades trying to prove that his mental illness was an elaborate fraud. Standing before federal judge Eugene Nickerson in a Brooklyn courtroom, Vincent pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy to commit murder and racketeering. But the most significant moment came when Judge Nickerson asked Vincent directly about his mental condition. In a clear, coherent voice that contrasted sharply with the incoherent mumbling that had characterized his public image for 30 years, Vincent admitted that he had faked mental illness to avoid prosecution. "I misled everyone," he said, his words carrying the weight of 3 decades of trickery. The courtroom was silent as the implications of Vincent's admission sank in. For the first time since the early 1970s, Vincent Gigante was speaking publicly as a competent, rational individual rather than as a confused, mentally ill old man. The change was so dramatic that even court officials who had expected this moment were struck by the contrast between Vincent's previous appearances and his current manner. Vincent's guilty plea included admissions that he had been boss of the Genovese crime family and that he had participated in planning murders, extortion, and other serious crimes while keeping up his active mental incompetence. These admissions gave prosecutors the definite proof they had sought for decades that Vincent's mental illness had been an elaborate act designed to avoid criminal prosecution. The plea agreement also required Vincent to provide some cooperation with federal authorities, including information about the structure and activities of the Genovese family. While this cooperation was limited compared to what other high-ranking organized crime figures had provided, it represented a complete abandonment of the traditional code of silence that had protected organized crime families for generations. Perhaps most remarkably, Vincent's admission came after federal judges had already ruled that he was competent to stand trial, suggesting that he had finally concluded that keeping up his trick was no longer possible and that pleading guilty was better than risking conviction at trial on more serious charges. On July 25, 2003, Judge Nickerson sentenced Vincent to 12 years in federal prison, a term that was considered lenient given the serious charges and Vincent's long criminal career. The sentence reflected Vincent's advanced age. He was 75 at the time, his cooperation with authorities, and the fact that his guilty plea had saved the government the time and expense of a complex trial. During the sentencing hearing, prosecutors presented a detailed account of Vincent's criminal activities and the impact of his crimes on victims and communities. They described him as the head of a criminal organization that had made hundreds of millions of dollars through illegal activities while corrupting legal businesses and government institutions. Vincent's attorneys argued for a lighter sentence based on his age, health problems, and the unique circumstances of his case. They emphasized that Vincent had never been convicted of personally committing acts of violence and that his role had been primarily organizational and strategic, rather than directly harmful to specific victims. Judge Nickerson's sentencing comments reflected both condemnation of Vincent's crimes and a certain admiration for the sophistication of his trick. The judge noted that Vincent had successfully fooled medical professionals, law enforcement officials, and the federal court system for 3 decades, and that his act had been one of the most elaborate criminal tricks in Sicily. American History. The judge also commented on the broader implications of Vincent's case for the federal justice system, noting that his successful trick had highlighted weaknesses in existing procedures for evaluating mental competency and had forced courts to develop new standards for detecting malingering and other forms of trickery. Vincent accepted his sentence without comment, keeping the dignified manner that had characterized his court appearances since his competency was established. His family members, who had supported his trick for decades, watched silently as he was led away to begin serving his prison term. Vincent's admission that he had faked mental illness for 30 years sent shockwaves through the organized crime world, law enforcement community, and general public. The revelation that someone had successfully kept up such an elaborate trick for so long raised questions about the effectiveness of existing legal and medical procedures for detecting fraud within organized crime circles. Vincent's admission was seen as both a betrayal and a strategic masterstroke. Some criminals viewed his decision to abandon the trick as evidence that he had lost his nerve or been broken by federal pressure. Others saw his 30-year act as proof of his exceptional intelligence and strategic thinking, even if it had ultimately failed to provide permanent protection from prosecution. Law enforcement officials expressed mixed reactions to Vincent's admission. Some agents who had spent years investigating him felt proved right by the confirmation that their suspicions had been correct. Others admitted to grudging admiration for the sophistication of Vincent's trick and the discipline required to keep it up for so long. The medical community was particularly shaken by Vincent's revelation, as it called into question the professional judgments of numerous psychiatrists and psychologists who had examined him over the years and concluded that his mental illness was genuine. The case prompted extensive discussion within psychiatric circles about improving methods for detecting malingering and other forms of trickery. Media coverage of Vincent's admission was extensive and largely focused on the implications of his successful trick. Many commentators expressed amazement that someone had been able to fool so many people for so long, while others criticized the systems and professionals who had failed to detect his fraud. The public reaction was generally one of fascination, mixed with concern about the implications for the justice system. Many Americans were intrigued by the story of Vincent's elaborate trick, but they were also troubled by the idea that someone could avoid prosecution for decades through such fraud. Vincent's time in prison at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, marked the end of his public act, but not the end of his influence within organized crime. Even in prison, he remained a respected figure among criminals and continued to command loyalty from former associates who were still active in the Genovese family. Prison officials noted that Vincent's behavior behind bars was markedly different from his public image during the previous 3 decades. He was described as intelligent, articulate, and well-behaved, interacting normally with other inmates and participating in prison programs and activities. The contrast with his previous appearance of mental incompetence was so dramatic that it provided additional confirmation that his condition had been faked. Vincent's time in prison was relatively uneventful, as he avoided the conflicts and violence that often characterized the imprisonment of high-profile criminals. His advanced age and reputation for intelligence earned him respect from other inmates, while his cooperation with authorities and acceptance of his sentence helped him avoid being targeted by rivals or enemies. During his imprisonment, Vincent reportedly reflected on his long criminal career and the trick that had defined much of his adult life. Prison counselors noted that he seemed to experience some relief at no longer having to keep up his active mental illness, though he rarely discussed his past activities or the specifics of His trick. Vincent's health began to decline during his prison years. As the physical and psychological toll of his long criminal career and decades of trickery became increasingly apparent, he developed several serious medical conditions that required ongoing treatment and eventually limited his ability to participate in prison activities. Despite his declining health, Vincent kept contact with family members and continued to receive visits from relatives who had supported him throughout his criminal career and legal troubles. These relationships provided him with some comfort during his final years and showed the enduring loyalty that his leadership had inspired. On December 19, 2005, Vincent Chin Gigante died in his sleep at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, where he had been transferred due to declining health. He was 77 years old and had served approximately 2.5 years of his 12-year sentence. Vincent's death marked the end of one of the most remarkable criminal careers in American history. From his beginnings as a failed boxer on the Lower East Side of Manhattan to his rise as the head of one of the most powerful crime families in the United States, his life covered nearly the entire modern history of organized crime in America. News of Vincent's death was covered extensively by media outlets around the world, with obituaries and looking back articles examining his life, crimes, and the elaborate trick that had defined his later career. Most coverage focused on his unprecedented 30-year act of mental illness and its implications for understanding both criminal behavior and the limitations of legal and medical institutions. Law enforcement officials who had investigated Vincent throughout his career offered respectful but critical assessments of his life and legacy. Many acknowledged his intelligence and organizational abilities while emphasizing the harm caused by his criminal activities and the problems created by his successful trick of the justice system. Vincent's funeral was a private affair attended by family members and a few close associates, reflecting the low-key approach that had characterized much of his life despite his prominent position in organized crime. The contrast with the elaborate funerals of other crime bosses highlighted Vincent's preference for avoiding public attention and keeping the understated image that had served him so well throughout his criminal career. Even in death, Vincent's influence on organized crime and law enforcement continued to be felt. His case had established important legal precedents about mental competency determinations and had led to significant changes in how federal agencies investigated and prosecuted sophisticated criminal businesses. Vincent's death created a significant leadership vacuum within the Genovese crime family, which had been structured around his unique management style and the elaborate security precautions required by his trick. The family faced the challenge of reorganizing itself while dealing with continued law enforcement pressure and the loss of the strategic thinking that had guided their operations for decades. The succession process was complicated by the fact that Vincent's long-running trick had created an unusual organizational structure in which multiple individuals had exercised apparent authority while actually putting into action Vincent's decisions. This structure had provided effective protection while Vincent was alive, but it created confusion about who should take over leadership after his death. Several potential successors emerged within the family, each with different approaches to leadership and different ideas about how the organization should adapt to changing conditions in organized crime. The transition period was marked by internal negotiations and careful maneuvering as various groups sought to establish their authority without triggering violent conflicts that would attract law enforcement attention. The family ultimately reorganized under new leadership that kept many of Vincent's strategic principles while adapting to new realities in organized crime. The new leadership structure emphasized continued secrecy, sophisticated business operations, an avoidance of the kind of public attention that had eventually led to Vincent's downfall. However, the Genovese family never regained the exceptional organizational discipline and strategic sophistication that had characterized Vincent's leadership. His unique combination of intelligence, patience, and willingness to sacrifice personal recognition for long-term success proved difficult to copy, and the family's influence slowly declined. In later years, the impact of Vincent's leadership style and his innovative approach to criminal organization continued to influence organized crime families throughout the United States. Many criminal organizations adopted parts of his operational security procedures, communication methods, and strategic thinking, though none were able to copy the comprehensive approach that had made him so successful. Vincent's successful trick for 3 decades prompted significant changes in how federal law enforcement agencies investigated, organized crime, and evaluated claims of mental incompetence by criminal defendants. The case became a landmark in the development of new investigative techniques and legal procedures designed to detect and defeat similar tricks. The FBI put into action new training programs for agents investigating organized crime, with specific emphasis on detecting sophisticated tricks and understanding the psychology of criminal leaders who might try to avoid prosecution through claims of mental illness. These programs included consultation with psychiatric professionals and behavioral analysis experts who could help agents recognize signs of malingering. Federal prosecutors also developed new legal strategies for challenging claims of mental incompetence, including more thorough standards for psychiatric evaluations and greater use of expert witnesses who specialized in detecting trickery. Vincent's case provided a template for building cases that could overcome competency defenses based on claimed mental illness. The case also led to changes in court procedures for evaluating mental competency, with judges given greater authority to order extended evaluations and to consider behavioral evidence that might contradict psychiatric testimony. These changes were designed to prevent future defendants from successfully using Vincent's strategy to avoid prosecution. Perhaps most importantly, Vincent's case showed the importance of long-term strategic thinking in organized crime investigations. Federal agencies learned that sophisticated criminal leaders might be willing to sacrifice short-term benefits and even accept personal hardships in pursuit of long-term goals, requiring investigators to adopt similarly patient and strategic approaches to their work. The lessons learned from Vincent's case influenced organized crime investigations for years after his death, with federal agencies applying insights from his trick to identify and prosecute other criminal leaders who tried to use similar strategies to avoid accountability for their crimes. The revelation that Vincent had successfully tricked numerous medical professionals for 30 years prompted extensive soul-searching within the psychiatric and psychological communities about their methods for diagnosing mental illness and detecting trickery. The case became a crucial learning experience that influenced how medical professionals approached similar cases in the future. Medical schools began including more extensive training on malingering and other forms of trickery in their psychiatry programs, with Vincent's case serving as a primary example of how sophisticated individuals could fool even trained professionals. This training emphasized the importance of considering alternative explanations for apparent symptoms and the need for objective checking of subjective claims. Professional organizations for psychiatrists and psychologists developed new guidelines for evaluating defendants in criminal cases, with particular emphasis on the importance of getting comprehensive information about individuals' backgrounds and behaviors outside of clinical settings. These guidelines were designed to help medical professionals avoid the kind of isolated evaluations that had failed to detect Vincent's trick. The case also led to the development of new diagnostic tools and assessment methods, specifically designed to detect malingering and other forms of trickery. These tools included structured interviews, psychological tests, and behavioral analysis techniques that could provide more objective measures of genuine mental illness. Perhaps most importantly, Vincent's case reminded medical professionals of the need for humility and skepticism in their evaluations, particularly when dealing with individuals who might have strong motivations to appear mentally ill. The case showed that even experienced professionals could be tricked by sufficiently sophisticated and committed actors. The medical community's response to Vincent's case ultimately strengthened the field's ability to detect trickery and provide more accurate assessments of mental competency in legal proceedings. These improvements helped make sure that future defendants would find it much more difficult to copy Vincent's successful strategy. Vincent Shin. Gigante's place in the history of American organized crime is unique and complex. While other crime bosses may have been more violent, more flamboyant, or more publicly notorious, none achieved Vincent's combination of criminal success and strategic innovation. His 30-year trick represents perhaps the most sophisticated and sustained criminal strategy in the history of organized crime. Vincent's criminal empire at its peak was estimated to make hundreds of millions of dollars yearly through gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and other illegal activities. But more impressive than the scale of his operations was their efficiency and sustainability. Unlike many other crime bosses who built empires that collapsed quickly due to internal conflicts or law enforcement pressure, Vincent created an organization that operated successfully for decades with minimal disruption. His innovative approach to criminal leadership challenged traditional assumptions about how organized crime families worked. While conventional wisdom suggested that crime bosses needed to project strength and demand visible respect, Vincent showed that true power could be exercised more effectively from the shadows. His willingness to sacrifice public recognition and traditional symbols of authority in exchange for operational security was unprecedented in organized crime. Vincent's strategic thinking extended beyond immediate criminal activities to include long-term planning that considered changing social, economic, and legal conditions. He understood that successful criminals in the modern era would need to adapt to evolving law enforcement techniques, changing economic opportunities, and shifting social attitudes toward organized crime. Perhaps most remarkably, Vincent's criminal success was achieved while keeping up an elaborate trick that required tremendous personal sacrifice and discipline. The fact that he was able to simultaneously run a sophisticated criminal organization and convince the world that he was mentally incompetent demonstrates exceptional intelligence and strategic ability. His legacy as a criminal mastermind is complicated by the obvious harm caused by his illegal activities and the corruption of legal institutions that his operations required. However, from a purely strategic perspective, Vincent's criminal career represents one of the most successful long-term criminal businesses in American history. Vincent's act of mental illness stands as one of the most remarkable tricks in recorded history, comparable to famous cases of fraud, but exceeding them in duration, sophistication, and consequences. For 30 years, he convinced medical professionals, law enforcement officials, journalists, and ordinary citizens that he was mentally incompetent while actually exercising sophisticated leadership of a major criminal organization. The psychological and intellectual challenges of keeping up such a trick were enormous. Vincent had to study mental illness extensively to understand how to present convincing symptoms, while avoiding behaviors that could be easily tested or checked. He had to keep consistent acting across thousands of interactions with hundreds of different people over 3 decades. The trick required Vincent to sacrifice many of the normal rewards of criminal success, including public recognition, obvious displays of wealth, and the kind of respect and deference that other crime bosses enjoyed. He had to be content with exercising power while appearing powerless, making important decisions while seeming unable to think rationally. Perhaps most challenging was the need to keep up the trick even during private moments with family and close associates. Vincent could never be completely certain that he wasn't being watched or recorded, so he had to stay in character, even when logic suggested that he should be able to relax his act. The success of Vincent's trick also required the cooperation and secrecy of dozens of family members and criminal associates, who had to keep up the fiction of his incompetence while continuing to take orders from him. This level of organizational discipline and loyalty was unprecedented and organized crime and speaks to Vincent's exceptional leadership abilities. The revelation that Vincent's mental illness had been faked forced a re-evaluation of numerous legal, medical, and journalistic assessments that had been based on the assumption that his condition was genuine. The case became a cautionary tale about the limitations of professional expertise and the possibility that even trained observers could be systematically tricked by sufficiently sophisticated trickery. Vincent's successful trick had deep and lasting effects on how law enforcement agencies approach organized crime investigations and how the federal justice system handles claims of mental incompetence by criminal defendants. His case became a watershed moment that prompted significant changes in investigative techniques, legal procedures, and professional training. The FBI's investigation of Vincent spanned multiple decades and involved some of the Bureau's most experienced organized crime investigators. The fact that these professionals were unable to definitely prove that Vincent's mental illness was faked until very late in his career highlighted the limitations of traditional investigative methods when dealing with sophisticated trickery. Case prompted the development of new surveillance techniques, behavioral analysis methods, and approaches to gathering evidence about criminal defendants' mental competence. These innovations influenced not only organized crime investigations but also other types of federal criminal cases involving claims of mental illness or incompetence. Federal prosecutors also had to develop new legal strategies for challenging competency claims and presenting evidence about defendants' actual mental states. Vincent's case provided both positive and negative lessons about how to build cases against defendants who claim to be mentally incompetent to stand trial. The broader impact on the federal justice system included changes in court procedures for evaluating mental competency, new standards for psychiatric evaluations of criminal defendants, and greater emphasis on comprehensive investigation of defendants' backgrounds and behaviors outside of clinical settings. Perhaps most importantly, Vincent's case showed the need for patience and strategic thinking in complex criminal investigations. His success in avoiding prosecution for decades showed that some criminals were willing to accept significant personal costs in pursuit of long-term goals, requiring law enforcement to adopt similarly long-term approaches to their investigations. Vincent's successful trick of numerous medical professionals over 30 years had significant implications for the psychiatric and psychological communities, prompting extensive examination of diagnostic methods and procedures for detecting trickery in clinical settings. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in traditional psychiatric evaluation methods, particularly when dealing with individuals who had strong motivations to appear mentally ill and the intelligence and resources to study and copy genuine psychiatric conditions. Vincent's ability to fool trained professionals repeatedly over many years called into question some fundamental assumptions about the reliability of clinical assessments. The medical community's response included the development of new diagnostic tools specifically designed to detect malingering and other forms of trickery, improvements in training programs for psychiatric professionals, and new guidelines for evaluating individuals in legal contexts where trickery might be suspected. The case also prompted discussions about the ethical obligations of medical professionals when evaluating individuals who might be trying to trick them, and the balance between providing appropriate care for genuinely ill patients and keeping skepticism about potentially tricky claims. Vincent's case became a standard teaching example in medical schools and professional training programs, showing both the sophistication that trickery could achieve and the importance of comprehensive evaluation methods that go beyond simple clinical interviews and observations. The long-term impact on the medical profession included greater awareness of the possibility of sophisticated trickery, improved methods for detecting malingering, and enhanced procedures for conducting forensic psychiatric evaluations in legal contexts. Vincent's story captured public imagination in ways that few organized crime cases have achieved, becoming the subject of books, documentaries, television programs, and countless news articles that examine both his criminal career and his remarkable trick. The public's fascination with his case reflected broader interests in criminal psychology, trickery, and the limits of institutional authority. The contrast between Vincent's public image as a harmless neighborhood oddball and his actual role as a sophisticated criminal leader created a compelling story that challenged conventional assumptions about criminal behavior and mental illness. His case became a symbol of the complexity of human psychology and the difficulty of telling the difference between appearance and reality. Media coverage of Vincent's case often focused on the almost theatrical parts of his trick, describing his daily walks through Greenwich Village in bathrobe and slippers as performance art rather than criminal strategy. The case also became a reference point for discussions about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the challenges faced by legal and medical professionals in evaluating individuals who might be trying to trick them. Vincent's successful trick highlighted the limitations of expert judgment and the possibility that even sophisticated institutional safeguards could be overcome by sufficiently determined and intelligent trickery. Public reaction to Vincent's eventual admission that his mental illness had been faked was generally one of amazement mixed with concern about the implications for the justice system and society more broadly. Many people were fascinated by the story of his three-decade act, while also troubled by the idea that such elaborate trickery was possible. Vincent's case provided numerous lessons for the criminal justice system about the challenges of prosecuting sophisticated criminals and the need for adaptive and innovative approaches to complex investigations and prosecutions. The most obvious lesson was the importance of keeping skepticism about claims that seemed to give defendants with convenient protections from prosecution. Vincent's successful use of mental incompetence claims to avoid trial for decades showed that even seemingly straightforward medical determinations could be manipulated by sufficiently sophisticated trickery. The case also highlighted the need for comprehensive investigations that consider all parts of defendants' lives and behaviors rather than relying only on clinical evaluations or other limited sources of information. Vincent's trick was successful partly because evaluators focused on his apparent symptoms rather than considering the broader context of his life and activities. Perhaps most importantly, Vincent's case showed that successful criminal prosecution sometimes requires patience and long-term strategic thinking that matches the sophistication of the criminals being investigated. His 30-year trick succeeded partly because he was willing to accept significant personal costs in pursuit of his long-term goal of avoiding prosecution. The case also provided lessons about the importance of cooperation and information sharing between agencies in complex criminal investigations. Vincent's successful trick was possible partly because different agencies and professionals were making independent evaluations without fully considering information available to other investigators. Finally, Vincent's case showed the need for continuous adaptation and innovation in criminal investigation and prosecution techniques. His success in using strategies that had never been tried before showed that criminals would continue to develop new methods for avoiding accountability, requiring law enforcement to remain flexible and creative in their responses. Despite Vincent's eventual admission that his mental illness had been faked, questions remain about various parts of his trick and its psychological impact on him personally. The line between act and reality became so blurred during his 30-year charade that even he may not have been entirely certain where his calculated behavior ended and genuine psychological effects began. Some observers have guessed that Vincent's long-term active mental illness may have had genuine psychological consequences, creating a form of self-caused mental condition that became partially real, even though it had started as deliberate trickery. The psychological toll of keeping up such an elaborate act for 3 decades would have been enormous and could have created genuine mental health issues. Others have wondered whether Vincent's trick was ever completely comprehensive or whether there were parts of his personality and behavior that remained real throughout his act. The complexity of human psychology makes it unlikely that anyone could completely separate their true self from a sustained act, suggesting that Vincent's trick may have been more nuanced than a simple case of faking mental illness. The question of when Vincent's trick began and how it evolved over time also remains partially mysterious. While the general timeline of his act is known, the specific decisions and circumstances that led to its development and refinement over many years involve personal motivations and calculations that only Vincent himself fully understood. Perhaps most intriguingly, questions remain about whether Vincent's eventual admission of trickery was itself completely honest, or whether it represented another calculated decision based on his assessment of his legal and personal situation. The possibility that even his confession involved elements of strategic thinking adds another layer of complexity to an already remarkable case. These enduring mysteries make sure that Vincent's case will continue to fascinate researchers, legal professionals, and the general public for years to come, serving as a reminder of the complexity of human behavior and the challenges involved in understanding the motivations and actions of truly exceptional individuals. On that December morning in 2005, when Vincent Gigante drew his last breath in a federal medical facility in Missouri, the curtain finally fell on one of the most extraordinary acts in criminal history. But even in death, the Oddfather kept one final mystery. Was his passing itself genuine, or had he somehow managed to plan one last trick? The question, of course, was absurd. Death is the one act that cannot be faked indefinitely. Yet the fact that such thoughts could even occur to those who had followed Vincent's remarkable career speaks to the deep impact his 3-decade charade had on everyone who encountered it. He had so thoroughly destroyed the boundaries between truth and act, between competence and incompetence, between reality and theater, that even the most obvious truths became subject to doubt. Vincent's legacy extends far beyond the criminal underworld he controlled for so many years. His story challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of truth, the reliability of expert judgment, and the limits of institutional authority. He proved that reality itself could be changeable in the hands of someone with sufficient intelligence, patience, and commitment to trickery. In the neighborhoods of Greenwich Village, where Vincent had shuffled through the streets in his bathrobe and slippers for 30 years. Old-timers still point out the corners where he used to have his famous conversations with parking meters. Some claim they always knew he was faking. Others insist they were genuinely fooled until the very end. The truth, as was so often the case with Vincent Gigante, probably lies somewhere in between. The Genovese crime family that Vincent built and led through his elaborate trick continued to operate after his death, though it never again achieved the remarkable combination of criminal success and organizational invisibility that characterized his leadership. Other crime bosses studied his methods and tried to adapt his strategies, but none possessed the unique combination of intelligence, discipline, and sheer boldness required to copy his achievements. In federal law enforcement agencies, Vincent's case became legendary, a reminder of both the limitations of traditional investigative methods and the importance of keeping skepticism, even when faced with seemingly obvious evidence. New agents learned about the Oddfather as part of their training, studying his techniques not to admire them, but to understand how such elaborate tricks could be detected and defeated. The medical professionals who had been tricked by Vincent's act used the experience to develop better methods for detecting malingering and other forms of trickery. His case became a standard teaching tool in psychiatric training programs, showing both the sophistication that trickery could achieve and the importance of comprehensive evaluation methods. But perhaps Vincent's most enduring legacy lies in the simple recognition that things are not always what they seem. In an age of increasing skepticism about institutions and authority figures, his story serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder that individual intelligence and determination can sometimes triumph over even the most sophisticated systems designed to detect and prevent trickery. The man who convinced the world he was crazy while running one of America's most powerful criminal organizations proved that reality itself could be an act, that weakness could be strength, that the most effective way to exercise power might be to appear powerless. His 3-decade charade succeeded not because the people watching him were stupid or incompetent, but because he understood something fundamental about human nature. We see what we expect to see, and once we form an opinion about someone, we tend to interpret all future evidence in ways that confirm our initial impressions. Vincent Chin Gigante died as he had lived during his final decades, quietly, without fanfare, keeping his secrets until the very end. He had spent 30 years convincing the world that Vincent Gigante was a harmless, mentally ill old man who couldn't hurt anyone. In the process, he had created one of the most successful criminal businesses in American history and pulled off the greatest trick the Mafia had ever seen. The Oddfather's final act was his death itself, the one performance that finally proved beyond doubt that Vincent Gigante was, in the end, simply human. But even that mortality served his legend, making sure that his remarkable story would outlive the man who created it and continue to fascinate and teach future generations about the complex relationship between appearance and reality, between act and truth. In the history of American crime, Vincent Chin Gigante stands alone not as the most violent criminal, not as the most wealthy, not as the most notorious, but as the most masterfully tricky. He proved that in the right hands, acting could become the ultimate criminal skill, that the greatest thefts involve not money or jewels, but the theft of truth itself. The bathrobe and slippers that had been his costume for 30 years were eventually thrown away, but the legend of the man who wore them while running a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars will endure. Vincent Gigante had achieved a form of immortality that most criminals never reach. He had become a story that would be told and retold, analyzed and debated for generations to come. And somewhere, perhaps in whatever realm the dead inhabit, Vincent Chin Gigante might be having the last laugh. After all, he had spent 3 decades proving that the impossible was possible, that the unbelievable could be believed, that even the most elaborate lies could become accepted truth. His final act, the act of being nothing more than a memory, may be his most successful yet. And so ends the extraordinary tale of Vincent Chin Gigante, a man who proved that sometimes the greatest criminal masterminds aren't the ones who can plan the perfect heist, but those who can plan the perfect lie. For nearly 3 decades, he convinced the world he was harmless, all while running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. What did you think of Chin's incredible trick? Could you imagine keeping up an act like that for 30 years? And do you think there might be other crime bosses out there right now, hiding in plain sight behind their own carefully crafted images? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love reading your perspectives on these complex characters. If you made it this far into the story, you're clearly someone who appreciates the deeper, more nuanced side of true crime. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our upcoming deep dives into other fascinating figures from the shadows of history. Hit that like button if this story kept you engaged, and share it with someone who would appreciate a good tale of trickery and power. Until next time, keep questioning what you see on the surface, because as Vincent Gigante proved, things aren't always what they seem. Sweet dreams, and thanks for spending these hours with me, exploring the darker corners of American history.